The lights of the studio flickered as the camera zoomed in on the set. A hush fell over the live audience, their eyes fixed on the two chairs that sat across from each other. At one end, Clint Eastwood, a man whose name alone was synonymous with rugged masculinity and unfiltered opinions. At the other, Sarah Rogers, the popular liberal talk show host who had become known for her bold, often controversial, views on everything from politics to pop culture. Today was not going to be like any other interview. As Sarah adjusted her notes, her eyes briefly flickered over to Clint, who was sitting back in his chair, relaxed as ever. His face, marked by age and experience, remained stoic, yet his eyes gleamed with a mischievous twinkle, as if he was already prepared for whatever curveballs Sarah had planned. She, on the other hand, was determined to prove a point. She had long been vocal about her disdain for what she saw as the old guard of Hollywood and politics, and Clint was at the top of her list. The countdown clock on the screen buzzed to life, signaling the start of the show. The audience erupted into applause, and the studio lights blazed brighter as Sarah took her seat. She flashed a smile, but the tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Not by a long shot. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Sarah Unfiltered, where we get down to the hard-hitting truths. No punches pulled, Sarah began, her voice steady but laced with the subtle edge of someone who was gearing up for a battle. Tonight, we have a guest who needs no introduction, an actor, a director, and a man whose views have made him a controversial figure time and time again, Clint Eastwood. The applause was louder this time, with some members of the audience standing in admiration, while others exchanged curious glances. Clint's reputation preceded him, and tonight, many were eager to see if the Hollywood legend would hold up under Sarah's infamous questioning. "Clint, welcome to the show," Sarah said, her tone more formal now, though a sharpness lingered beneath her words. "Thanks, Sarah," Clint replied, his voice gravelly but calm. He didn't seem nervous or fazed by the intensity of the moment. He simply gave her a small, knowing smile. "So, let's jump right in," Sarah began, flipping through her notes, her expression shifting to one of determination. "You've been outspoken about your conservative views for years, and yet, you've had a long career in a very liberal industry. How do you reconcile the two?" Clint leaned forward slightly, adjusting his posture, but his demeanor remained completely unfazed. "Well, Sarah," he started, his voice cool and steady, "I've always been a believer in speaking my mind, no matter where I am. Hollywood, politics, they're all the same to me. I do what I believe in, and I don't expect everyone to agree with me." Sarah tilted her head, clearly ready to push further. "But surely, Clint, in an industry where most people lean left, you've had to face some backlash? Isn't it tough being a conservative icon in a sea of liberals?" Clint's lips curled into a small smile, as if he'd been expecting this question. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly before responding. "You know, Sarah, it's funny. People often think that because you have a different opinion, you must be some kind of outsider. But the truth is, everyone has their own beliefs. Just because mine don't align with what's popular doesn't mean I'm any less of a person or actor," Clint said, his tone now even more direct. Sarah narrowed her eyes slightly, sensing a slight hint of resistance in his words. "So, you think Hollywood's liberal views are just some trend? That they'll go away?" Clint leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "Not at all. I respect people's right to believe what they want. But trends come and go, and at the end of the day, it's about staying true to who you are. That's all I've ever done." Sarah's gaze sharpened as she prepared for the next question. "But Clint, with your history of playing roles that embody masculinity, independence, and individualism, don't you think you're sending a message that clashes with today's culture? A culture that calls for more inclusivity, more compassion for others, especially those who are marginalized." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's question had landed squarely in the heart of the issue, and everyone in the studio knew it. Clint, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a soft chuckle. "I think the message I've always tried to send is that we're all human," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "The world's changing, and that's fine. I've always believed in standing up for what's right, even if it's not the popular thing to do." There was a brief silence. Sarah was taken aback. She had expected Clint to get defensive, to backtrack, maybe even become annoyed. But instead, his response was straightforward, yet thoughtful. For a moment, she wasn't sure where to take the conversation next. "Interesting," she said, her voice tinged with something akin to respect, but she quickly recovered, her eyes gleaming with renewed energy. "So, would you say you're someone who doesn't believe in compromise?" Clint leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto hers. "Not at all. I think compromise is important in some situations. But in others, when it comes to the core of your beliefs, you can't compromise who you are." The audience sat in rapt attention. Clint's calm, measured responses were having an effect, both on Sarah and on the viewers at home. For the first time in a while, she was faced with a man who wouldn't back down, who didn't feel the need to apologize for his views. "You know, Clint," Sarah said after a beat, her smile growing slightly, "I'm starting to realize that maybe we have more in common than I thought." Clint's eyebrows raised just slightly, a twinkle in his eye. "Maybe," he replied with a hint of humor. "I think we'll find that out as the night goes on." "Definitely," Sarah said, turning to the camera. "And I have a feeling we're just getting started, folks." The tension in the room had shifted slightly. There was no denying it now. This wasn't going to be a typical interview. Sarah had come prepared to challenge Clint, but so far, Clint had been one step ahead. As the camera panned across the studio, the audience knew they were witnessing something special. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the next move, because it was clear. No one could predict where this conversation was going. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This might just be the interview that changes the game. What's the most memorable moment you've seen on TV? Sarah's voice cut through the silence, a sly smile tugging at her lips as she glanced back at Clint, her thoughts already turning to what was coming next. The battle of wits had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been a man of few words, but those words carried weight. As the camera lingered on his face, a silent history seemed to echo in his eyes. He wasn't just the actor who had portrayed the iconic man with no name, or the tough-as-nails cop in Dirty Harry. Clint Eastwood was a symbol of rugged individualism, someone who had weathered decades of success, controversy, and change in both Hollywood and politics. Growing up in the small town of San Francisco, Clint didn't have the easy ride that many of Hollywood's biggest stars experienced. Born in 1930, Clint's early life was marked by a sense of instability and change. His family moved around frequently, and young Clint spent much of his time feeling like an outsider. He didn't have the usual trappings of fame, no silver spoon, no glamorous upbringing. His family wasn't wealthy, and his parents worked hard to make ends meet. "I wasn't born into a life of privilege," Clint had once said in an interview, a rare glimpse into the man behind the public persona. "I had to learn the value of hard work early on, and that's something I've never forgotten." It wasn't until Clint was in his early 20s that he made his way to Hollywood. At first, he wasn't the leading man. He was just another face in a crowd of hopeful actors. His big break came when he was cast in Rawhide, a popular TV Western series that ran from 1959 to 1965. It was there, in the harsh desert landscapes of the American West, that Clint began to form the persona that would later define his career. But Clint wasn't interested in just being the pretty boy on screen. He wanted to be a storyteller. In the late 1960s, after his successful run in Rawhide, Clint's name became synonymous with the Western genre. His portrayal of the stoic gunslinger in A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, catapulted him to international stardom, but it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, 1966, that cemented his place in film history. With each movie, Clint's characters became more complex. He wasn't just the tough guy, but the morally ambiguous anti-hero who questioned the rules of society. He had a way of making the audience feel both discomfort and admiration for his characters, and that complexity drew viewers in. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just about the roles he played. As his acting career soared, Clint began to explore directing. It was a natural progression for a man who always seemed to be more interested in the story than the spotlight. He made his directorial debut with Play Misty for Me in 1971, and the film was a critical success, showcasing Clint's talents behind the camera as well as in front of it. Clint's career was marked by a deep desire to create films that spoke to real human experiences, not just fantasy. His films, whether it was Unforgiven, 1992, or Million Dollar Baby, 2004, often explored themes of redemption, morality, and the cost of personal sacrifice. It was clear that Clint wasn't just making movies. He was shaping an ideology, one rooted in personal responsibility, self-sufficiency, and, above all, authenticity. However, while Clint was becoming a Hollywood icon, his personal life was often shrouded in mystery. He had been married twice and had a number of relationships, but he was never one to air his personal struggles in public. He had children, yes, but he rarely discussed them in interviews. The public saw Clint as a tough guy who didn't need to share his emotions to be understood. His life, in a sense, mirrored his most famous roles. Quiet, stoic, and filled with a strong sense of personal conviction. As Clint aged, his political views became more outspoken, drawing both admiration and criticism. He was a staunch conservative, and his views on government intervention, personal freedom, and the role of the individual often clashed with the progressive leanings of Hollywood. In 2012, he famously addressed the Republican National Convention in a memorable, somewhat controversial speech, speaking directly to an empty chair as though it were President Obama. The moment became a symbol of Clint's irreverent and sometimes unpredictable nature, but it also highlighted his long-standing frustrations with the political system. Through all the highs and lows, Clint Eastwood had built a career that was not only influential in Hollywood, but also in shaping American cultural identity. He had become a symbol of resilience and integrity, but also a reminder that there were consequences to the choices we make. His films were never just about entertainment. They were about life, with all its struggles and triumphs. Sitting on the talk show set across from Sarah Rogers, Clint's experiences seemed to inform every word he spoke. He wasn't just a guest. He was a man who had seen the world change and had no intention of pretending to fit in with the latest trends. As Sarah looked over her notes, she tried to get a clearer picture of the man in front of her. She was aware of his history, his fame, and his politics. But what she hadn't anticipated was the quiet intensity that radiated from Clint. The man who had built a reputation as a tough guy action hero was also a man who knew exactly who he was, and he wasn't interested in appeasing anyone. "So, Clint," Sarah began again, trying to steer the conversation in a more personal direction. "You've been in the public eye for over 6 decades now. I think a lot of people would love to know, what's the key to maintaining your relevance for so long?" Clint took a moment to think before answering, his voice as steady as ever. "I've never been interested in relevance, Sarah. I've always just focused on doing the work, telling the stories I believe in. I don't worry about staying relevant. I just worry about being real." Sarah's gaze softened for a moment as she considered his answer. For the briefest of moments, the hard edge she had brought to the interview seemed to dissipate. She wasn't sure whether she agreed with him, but she could certainly understand where he was coming from. "You know," she said, her voice almost contemplative, "I admire that. In a world where everyone is obsessed with the next big thing, the next trend, it's refreshing to hear someone talk about staying true to themselves." Clint nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not always easy. But if you can't stay true to who you are, then what's the point?" There was a quiet pause as Sarah let his words sink in. She had come into this interview ready to challenge Clint, to expose him for what she believed to be an outdated perspective. But something about him, something in the way he spoke, made her pause. "Right," Sarah said, clearing her throat. "So, let's talk about the political climate right now. It's a tough time in the country. Do you think we've lost sight of what really matters?" Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharp focus. "I think we've forgotten what it means to be responsible for ourselves and for each other. It's easy to point fingers, but at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to make this country work. If we're not willing to do that, then we're in trouble." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a movie star. He was a man with a lifetime of wisdom and a commitment to his beliefs that couldn't be shaken by the whims of public opinion. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. This conversation is just getting started. Stick with us, folks. You won't want to miss what happens next. The studio was buzzing with energy as the audience hung on every word exchanged between Sarah Rogers and Clint Eastwood. The interview had taken an unexpected turn, with Clint's calm demeanor and unwavering conviction taking center stage. What started as a battle of ideologies was beginning to feel more like a dance, each of them taking steps to gain the upper hand. Sarah adjusted herself in her chair, preparing for her next line of questioning. She had anticipated Clint's conservative stance, but his ability to remain composed, to not be rattled by her questions, had caught her off guard. She was used to being in control of these interviews, but something about Clint's presence made it clear that this wasn't going to be a one-sided conversation. So, Clint, I'm hearing what you're saying about personal responsibility, Sarah began, her voice now sharper than before. But don't you think that's a bit idealistic? In today's world, where we have systemic issues like poverty, inequality, and climate change, it's not enough to just do the work or stay true to yourself. Don't you think the government has a role to play in addressing these issues? Clint sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't immediately respond, instead taking a moment to assess Sarah's words. The camera captured his silence, emphasizing the tension in the room. The audience could feel the weight of his thoughts hanging in the air. I believe in the power of the individual, Clint finally said, his voice calm but firm. Sure, we have problems, big ones, no doubt, but I think we've lost our way by relying too much on the government to solve them. People need to take responsibility for their own lives. That's where real change begins. When we start depending on the system to fix everything, we lose sight of the fact that we, as individuals, have the ability to make a difference. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't the response she had hoped for. She had been prepared to challenge Clint's ideas, to take him down a peg, but his words resonated with a certain authority that left her struggling to find the right retort. Okay, but Clint, don't you think that some things are just beyond the individual's control? Sarah pressed. I mean, take healthcare, for example. People are dying because they can't afford treatment. How can you expect someone living paycheck to paycheck to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they can't even get basic healthcare? Clint's gaze never wavered. I'm not saying there's no need for reform. What I'm saying is that we need to encourage self-reliance. We can't have a society where everyone is waiting for someone else to solve their problems. The government can provide a safety net, but it shouldn't be the first line of defense. People should take ownership of their own lives and work to improve their circumstances. Sarah was visibly frustrated. This wasn't going according to plan. She had expected Clint to soften, to give her something she could use to discredit him, but he was standing firm in his beliefs, even when it was clear they didn't align with the progressive views she championed. You know, Clint, Sarah said, her voice growing more pointed, I think a lot of people would say that your idea of personal responsibility is rooted in privilege. You've had a successful career, but not everyone has the same opportunities. What about those who are born into poverty, those who face discrimination? Do you really believe they can simply pull themselves up? Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. The tone in his voice shifted, becoming more intense as he responded. Look, I don't deny that some people have it harder than others. Life isn't fair, and it never has been. But that doesn't mean you throw in the towel and wait for someone to hand you a solution. It means you keep fighting, no matter what. His words struck a nerve. Sarah was taken aback by the sheer force of his conviction. This wasn't just some Hollywood star spouting off political opinions. This was a man who had lived through decades of change and challenge, a man who had seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of both Hollywood and American society. But Sarah wasn't about to back down. So, you're telling me that people who are struggling to survive, who are literally fighting for their next meal, should just keep fighting? It's easy to say that when you've got the money and fame to back up your words. For most people, that fight is a daily struggle. Clint's expression remained impassive, but there was a shift in his posture. His calmness was no longer just a defense mechanism. It had become his weapon. I'm not saying it's easy, Clint said, his voice lowering. What I'm saying is that giving up isn't an option. It's about finding a way out, even when it feels impossible. It's about determination, about grit. The audience was hanging on to every word. Sarah's words had challenged Clint, but now, in the face of his resolute response, it seemed as though she was the one being tested. This wasn't the easy interview she had planned. Clint's ability to stay composed, to stay true to his beliefs, was making it harder for her to break him. "You know, Clint," Sarah said, her tone quieter now, "you talk about grit, but I can't help but wonder if it's just a matter of luck. You had the privilege of growing up in a time when opportunities were more accessible. Not everyone has that chance." Clint's lips twitched upward, and for a moment, a glimmer of something like amusement passed through his eyes. "I've been lucky, sure. But luck alone doesn't get you through the tough times. It's what you do with that luck that matters." There was a brief pause. The energy in the room had shifted, and Sarah was no longer sure if she was making headway or if Clint was simply too set in his ways to be moved. But she knew one thing for certain. This interview wasn't over yet. "You know what, Clint?" Sarah said with a determined smile. "I think you might be right about one thing. We've definitely got a lot more to talk about." "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," Sarah said, her voice light but laced with a hint of challenge. "What's the most important issue facing America today?" We'll be right back after the break. The camera cut to a commercial, but the audience could still feel the undercurrent of tension in the air. Sarah's sharp questions had pushed Clint, but Clint had fought back with quiet, unwavering conviction. Neither had backed down, and it was clear to everyone that this was just the beginning. As the show returned from the commercial break, the audience's anticipation was palpable. The lights in the studio brightened, casting a sharp glow on Clint Eastwood's weathered face. He was sitting comfortably, almost as if nothing could rattle him, but there was a certain energy in the air, an energy that was about to shift into something more intense. Sarah Rogers was poised, ready for the next round of this ideological duel, but Clint wasn't about to make it easy. Sarah took a deep breath, straightening up in her chair. The opening act had left her unsettled. Clint's responses were sharp, deliberate, and confident. She wasn't used to being on the defensive, and Clint was showing no signs of backing down. But now, with the break behind them, she felt a new wave of determination. "Clint, you've said a lot about individual responsibility, but in your lifetime, you've seen a country divided on many issues. From the Vietnam War to the fight for civil rights, there have been times when this country was at war with itself. What do you make of today's divide?" Sarah's voice was steady now, more measured than before, but there was an unmistakable challenge in it. Clint sat forward slightly, his fingers interlaced in his lap, eyes narrowing as he considered her words. He wasn't someone who typically responded quickly. He preferred to weigh his options, like a seasoned player assessing his next move. "Well, Sarah," he began, his voice slow but firm, "the country has always been divided. Look at the Civil War. Look at the Great Depression. We've had our share of tough times. But what people often forget is that in those moments of division, people still managed to come together. We didn't always agree on everything, but we found a way to keep moving forward. We didn't wait for someone else to fix it for us." Sarah looked at Clint, her face a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "So, you're saying that no matter how bad things get, it's up to the individual to pull themselves out of the mess? Even now, with all the chaos in politics, climate change, and social injustice." Clint's gaze didn't falter. "I'm not saying it's all up to the individual, but individuals are where it starts. We need to look at the bigger picture, sure, but change, real change, comes when people take responsibility for their actions. When they decide they're going to do something about it instead of just pointing fingers." Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. It was clear that Clint wasn't going to give her the answer she wanted. His perspective was rooted in a belief that seemed almost too simple in today's complicated world. But in his eyes, it was anything but simple. It was the foundation of everything. "Clint," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower, "we're living in a world where people are more divided than ever. You've seen how hard it can get. In your own life, you've faced adversity. So how do you reconcile your beliefs with the very real struggles people are facing today? How do you stand by the idea of personal responsibility when so many people are born into circumstances beyond their control?" The question hung in the air. The cameras were trained on Clint, the silence stretching between them as the audience waited for his response. Sarah was fishing for a crack, some sign of doubt. She had seen Clint's tough exterior, but surely there was a vulnerable side. A side that understood the complexities of life beyond the idealistic man he portrayed on screen. Clint paused, his eyes drifting toward the studio lights above him. It was almost as if he were seeing something far beyond the glare of the television set. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low but full of purpose. "You can't control where you're born, Sarah. That's a fact of life. But once you're here, it's up to you to decide what you're going to do with the hand you've been dealt. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to feel like you're at the bottom. But there's something in every person, the ability to fight, to survive, and to build a better life." His words weren't just a defense of his own beliefs. They were a call to action. He wasn't offering sympathy or empty promises. Clint Eastwood was offering the raw truth that he believed in with every fiber of his being. It was up to each person to make the most of their own life, no matter the odds. "You've heard the stories of the greats," Clint continued, his voice gaining momentum. "The people who overcame impossible odds, not because they had help from the system, but because they didn't give up. Look at the great American stories. The ones who rose up from nothing and changed the world. That's what America is all about." Sarah was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had heard these arguments before, from pundits and politicians, but there was something about Clint's delivery that hit differently. His words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were the words of a man who had lived through it, who had seen the pain and the triumph firsthand. And despite her disagreement, Sarah couldn't deny the weight of his experience. "I know you believe that, Clint," Sarah said quietly, her voice softening. "But not everyone has the same opportunities, and some people are simply too far behind to catch up. What do you say to those people? The ones who feel like they don't have a fighting chance?" Clint leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "I say you keep fighting anyway." It was simple, powerful, and it landed like a punch. For a moment, there was an almost tangible shift in the air. The tension between Clint and Sarah had reached its peak, and it was clear that this conversation was no longer about facts or statistics. It was about belief. And for Clint Eastwood, that belief was unwavering. The audience was quiet, absorbing his words. Even Sarah seemed taken aback, momentarily speechless. The studio lights felt dimmer now, as though the conversation had moved into deeper waters. Waters where ideology clashed with reality, and where no easy answers existed. "Clint," Sarah said after a long pause, "I think we could talk about this all day, and we'd never agree. But I'll give you this. You've definitely given me something to think about." Clint smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "That's all I can ask for." For a moment, the audience was left to process the weight of the conversation. The ideological battle between Clint and Sarah wasn't just a clash of words. It was a confrontation of worldviews, a clash of values that defined each of them. And for all their differences, they had one thing in common. Both were driven by a fierce conviction in their beliefs. The studio lights flickered again, and Sarah turned to the camera. "Well, folks, that's it for today's segment. You've heard from one of Hollywood's most legendary icons, Clint Eastwood, the man who has stood the test of time and never backed down from a fight. What do you think? Is his message one that resonates with you? Or is it a message from another time? Hit subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment with where you're watching from. We'll be right back after the break." As the cameras cut to a commercial, the conversation lingered in the air, leaving the audience to reflect on the clash of ideas that had just unfolded. For Clint, it was just another day of standing by his convictions. For Sarah, it was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some battles aren't won in one conversation. But this was far from over, and neither of them would back down. The next few minutes in the studio felt like an eternity for Sarah Rogers. The debate with Clint Eastwood had pushed her to her limits, challenging everything she thought she knew about politics, ideology, and the human spirit. She had prepared herself for the inevitable ideological clash, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional weight of Clint's unwavering conviction. When the cameras returned to the live broadcast, Sarah forced herself to maintain composure, but she felt a shift in the air. Something had changed. This wasn't just a conversation about policy anymore. It was about the very soul of the country and what it meant to be an individual within it. The audience had noticed it, too. The tension in the room was palpable, and though the lights were still bright, there was a sense of quiet intensity that hung in the air like a thick fog. Sarah could feel the eyes of the audience on her, but for the first time in her career, she didn't know how to navigate the conversation anymore. Clint, on the other hand, seemed entirely unfazed. His posture was relaxed, his hands rested comfortably in his lap, and his eyes never strayed from Sarah's. To him, this was just another moment, a moment where he would stand firm in his beliefs, regardless of how the world might try to push him down. After a brief silence, Sarah took a deep breath. Her fingers fidgeted with the edges of her notes she hadn't even looked at for the last few minutes. She was no longer interested in sticking to her predetermined questions. There was something more important happening now, something personal. Clint, I have to admit, I don't agree with a lot of what you've said. But what you said about responsibility, about fighting for a better life, no matter how hard things get, something about it struck me, Sarah began, her voice quieter than usual. The camera zoomed in on her, capturing the sincerity in her expression. Clint raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His silence urged her to continue. I've spent so many years believing that the system has to be the answer, that we need to fix everything from the top down. But after hearing you talk, I can't help but think, maybe I've been looking at it all wrong, she continued, a hint of vulnerability in her tone. Maybe it's not just about the system. Maybe it's about us, about the people. The words felt strange as they left her mouth. For years, she had argued for the importance of systemic change, of the need for the government to step in and address the root causes of inequality. But Clint's calm, unwavering belief in the power of the individual was starting to resonate with her, in a way she hadn't expected. Clint didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened, a flicker of acknowledgement crossing his features. He could see the shift happening within Sarah. She was struggling, no doubt, but there was a part of her that was beginning to see what he had been saying all along. He had always known that there were no easy answers, but sometimes it wasn't about having all the answers. It was about finding the courage to keep searching. Look, Clint said, his voice steady, I'm not saying the system doesn't need work, but we have to start by looking inward. If we expect change to come from the top, we'll always be disappointed. Real change starts with the individual. If each person makes the choice to take responsibility for their own life, we can begin to create the kind of world we want to live in. Sarah nodded, her mind reeling from the weight of Clint's words. She had always believed that the world needed to be fixed through large-scale reforms. But here was Clint, a man who had lived through so many of the country's most tumultuous periods, telling her that real change started with the individual. Start with yourself. The audience was silent, captivated by the raw, emotional exchange unfolding before them. Sarah could feel the gravity of the moment, the deep, almost overwhelming realization that this was no longer just a conversation about politics. This was about hope, about human resilience in the face of adversity. You know, Clint, Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, I've been so focused on what's broken in this country, I forgot about what's still working. I forgot about the people who are still fighting, even when it feels like they have nothing left to give. Maybe they're the ones who can fix it. Clint's lips twitched into a small smile. There was a sense of relief in his expression, as though the walls between them had finally come down. You're starting to get it, Sarah, he said, his tone genuine, but with that signature Eastwood grit. It's not easy. Nothing worth fighting forever is. But people have more power than they realize. If we all just take a stand, things will get better. Maybe not right away, but in time. For a moment, there was no need for words. Sarah looked at Clint, and in his eyes, she saw a glimmer of understanding that hadn't been there before. It was as if she had crossed a threshold where the fight for a better world wasn't about who was in power, but about the choices each of them made every day. Clint, I think I understand now, Sarah said, the weight of her words settling in. Maybe the fight for a better world starts with the individual, with the choices we make every day. Maybe that's where real change begins. Clint nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. Exactly. It all starts with one person deciding they're not going to give up. The audience could feel the powerful shift in the room. There was a collective understanding, a realization that no matter how much they disagreed on the specifics, both Clint and Sarah had found something common in that moment, a shared sense of hope and the belief that change was possible if only they were willing to fight for it. As the cameras panned across the studio, Sarah glanced down at her notes once more. The page was filled with questions she had prepared, questions that had seemed so important just an hour ago. But now, those questions felt trivial. The conversation they had just had was about something far more significant than any scripted debate. "Well, folks," Sarah said, her voice full of newfound sincerity, "I think this has been one of the most important conversations I've had in a long time. Clint, thank you for your honesty. It's been a privilege." Clint gave a simple nod. "Anytime, Sarah." The camera cut to a commercial break, but the conversation lingered in the air. There was no easy resolution, no neatly tied-up ending. But in that moment, both Clint and Sarah had reached a place of understanding. An understanding that, perhaps, the real battle wasn't out there in the political arena, but inside each of them. And with that, the story wasn't over yet. It had just begun. The studio was quiet as the cameras cut to black, leaving the audience at home in suspense. Sarah Rogers sat in her chair, looking down at her notes, but her mind was elsewhere. Clint Eastwood's words had left an impression on her, a profound shift that she hadn't been expecting. What had started as a heated debate about politics and personal responsibility had turned into something more, a reflection on the very nature of change, human will, and resilience. She sat for a moment longer, allowing the quiet to settle in. The bustling of the crew preparing for the next segment seemed far away. Clint had said something that resonated deep inside her, something about fighting for what you believe in, no matter the odds. She could feel the truth in those words, even though she didn't fully agree with them. Maybe she never would. But there was something undeniably powerful about Clint's unwavering conviction. Sarah's producer, Lisa, walked up to her with a soft smile. "You did great, Sarah. That was something. You really held your own there." Sarah nodded absently, still lost in thought. She knew the producers would want to talk about the ratings, the audience's reactions, in the next segment. But right now, she was too deep in her own head to focus on that. "Thanks, Lisa," Sarah replied, her voice distant. "But I'm not sure if I did hold my own, you know? I mean, Clint, he's got this way of looking at things, and I think it hit me harder than I was ready for." Lisa raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking at the ceiling as though seeking answers from the studio lights. "I've always believed that the system needs to change from the top down, that we need reforms, legislation, policy changes. But Clint, he made me wonder if maybe it starts with us, the people. If we just keep waiting for the government to fix things, we're missing the point. Change starts with what we're willing to do, individually." Lisa gave a soft chuckle. "Sounds like Clint made a real impact on you." Sarah smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Maybe too much. I've spent so long fighting for the big picture that I forgot about the small, individual moments that lead to real change. People often say that change doesn't happen overnight, but what if it starts with each of us? One person at a time?" Lisa nodded, understanding the weight of Sarah's words. "It's a big realization, but maybe it's true. Maybe the real power lies with the people, not just the systems we've been relying on for years." As Sarah sat in the quiet studio, reflecting on her encounter with Clint, she realized that this conversation was more than just a media event. It had become a moment of introspection, not just for her, but for everyone watching. This wasn't just about ideological differences. It was about the human spirit and the willingness to fight for something better. It was about personal responsibility, community, and the hope that no matter how dire things seemed, there was always a way forward. The camera crew began packing up their equipment, preparing for the end of the day. The producers were busy discussing the next show, but Sarah stayed still, letting her mind drift to the bigger picture. She thought about her own journey, how she had climbed the ranks in her career, how she had fought for her beliefs, and how sometimes, in the fight for change, she had lost sight of the people she was fighting for. "Do you think this will change the way people see me?" Sarah asked, more to herself than to Lisa. "Why wouldn't it?" Lisa replied, shrugging. You've been on the right side of the issues for so long. But this conversation with Clint shows that you're human too. People want to see that. They want to see that you're not just some talking head with opinions. You're someone who can reflect, who can learn, and maybe even change your mind. That's real. Sarah let out a slow breath. Lisa was right. This was bigger than just a TV show or a debate. It was about the power of real conversation, the kind of dialogue that made people think and question their beliefs. And she had been part of something profound, something that could make a difference. As she looked around the studio, she found herself thinking about Clint. The man was stubborn, unyielding, and resolute. But those same qualities were what made him compelling, and maybe, just maybe, they were the key to understanding the message he had been trying to convey all along. Change wasn't about waiting for someone else to make the first move. It was about taking ownership, about making decisions in the face of adversity, about standing firm in your beliefs, and about never giving up, no matter how hard the road seemed. Later that evening, as Sarah drove home, she reflected on her conversation with Clint Eastwood. It wasn't just about policy or ideology, it was about people. It was about taking responsibility for your own life, making the decision to rise above the challenges, and leading by example. That's what Clint had meant when he talked about individual responsibility. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her producer, Sarah. Ratings are through the roof. People are talking about the Clint interview. We'll need to keep the momentum going for next week. Sarah smiled, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual adrenaline rush of success or the excitement of breaking news. It was something deeper, something that made her feel grounded, as though she had learned something valuable not just for her career, but for her life. The debate may have ended, but the reflection was just beginning. Sarah had already begun to see the world through a different lens, one where individual actions mattered more than ever, and where the smallest decisions could ripple out and create real change. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. As she pulled into her driveway and turned off the car, Sarah sat for a moment, staring at the darkened house. A feeling of peace washed over her. Clint Eastwood had given her more than a debate. He had given her a new perspective, one that she would carry with her for years to come. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to fight for something different. The following week was a whirlwind of media appearances, debates, and interviews. Everywhere Sarah went, people were talking about her conversation with Clint Eastwood. The internet buzzed with opinions, some agreeing with Clint's perspective, others criticizing him, but all acknowledging the weight of what had transpired on live television. For Sarah, the aftermath was overwhelming. She had spent years crafting a persona as a staunch advocate for systemic change, always fighting for reforms, policies, and government intervention. But now, she was faced with a new reality. The old, rigid beliefs that had shaped her career were starting to feel less certain, less convincing. In the days following the broadcast, Sarah had received a flood of messages from colleagues, viewers, and even strangers. Some people praised her for showing vulnerability, admitting her doubts, and engaging with Clint on a deeper level. Others were less kind, accusing her of compromising her beliefs or being swayed by a Hollywood icon. Sarah had to admit to herself that she was no longer the person she had been before that conversation. Clint had cracked open a door in her mind, and now, she couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what he had said. "I thought I knew everything," she said aloud to herself one evening as she sat in her living room. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window, the quiet city street outside illuminated by streetlights. "I thought I had all the answers. But now I'm not so sure." It wasn't just about Clint Eastwood either. It was about the people she interacted with daily. Her colleagues, her family, the viewers who tuned in every week. She had prided herself on pushing for change from the top down, believing that legislative action and large-scale reforms could solve the country's issues. But Clint had made her see that maybe she had been focusing too much on the big picture, too focused on the system, and not enough on the individual, the people who were living with these issues day in and day out. "Maybe it really does start with us," she muttered, leaning forward on the couch. "Maybe real change begins with personal responsibility. But can we really change the world one person at a time?" The question lingered in her mind for days. She found herself questioning the work she had done, the policies she had championed, and the values she had believed in so firmly. The doubt gnawed at her, but it also gave birth to a new curiosity, a curiosity about what might happen if she took a different approach. What if, instead of solely relying on the system, she focused more on empowering individuals to take ownership of their lives? Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from her best friend, Jessica, who had watched the interview. "Hey, I know we've been talking about Clint a lot, but I just wanted to say, I think you've been doing the right thing all along. Don't let that one conversation change who you are." Sarah smiled softly, but the words didn't provide the comfort she expected. She knew Jessica was trying to be supportive, but this wasn't about returning to her old self. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that interview with Clint, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to be. Instead of responding right away, Sarah set the phone down and took a long, deep breath. It was clear that something had shifted within her. But what exactly was that shift? Was it a temporary doubt? Or had Clint's perspective truly opened her eyes to a new way of thinking? The next day, she sat in her office, staring at the blank screen of her computer. She had been asked to write an editorial about the fallout from her interview with Clint. At first, she had resisted, unsure of how to convey what had happened in a way that didn't make her seem weak or indecisive. But now, as she stared at the cursor blinking back at her, she knew what she needed to say. With a deep breath, Sarah started typing. Her fingers flew over the keys, pouring out her thoughts without a filter. The article began to take shape quickly, and as she read over the words, she realized she was beginning to find her voice in all of this. It wasn't about choosing sides, about being for or against Clint's viewpoint. It was about the conversation itself, the openness to reevaluate one's beliefs, and the courage to admit when you might not have all the answers. Change begins with us, not just with politicians or lawmakers. It starts with the choices we make every day. It's about taking responsibility for ourselves, for our communities, and for the world around us. And while systemic change is important, it's equally important that we, as individuals, start living our values. We can't wait for the government to fix everything. Real change comes when we take action, one person at a time. She sat back in her chair, reading over the words once more. It was raw, it was honest, and it reflected where she was in that moment. It wasn't a neatly packaged conclusion. It was a step toward understanding, a realization that the fight for change wasn't just about politics, it was about the people who lived within the system, who were affected by it every single day. As Sarah clicked send, she knew the article would spark more conversation. It would lead to more debates, more questions. But this time, she felt ready. Because no matter how uncomfortable it was, she was learning something vital. Real growth came from being willing to listen, to change, and to start from within. Later that week, Sarah received a message from Clint himself. It wasn't a grand speech or a lengthy letter, just a short, to-the-point note that read, "Keep fighting, Sarah. But remember, it's not always about winning the fight. It's about doing what's right." She smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude and clarity she hadn't expected. Clint had always been a man of few words, but those words were enough. And as she looked out her window that night, the city lights twinkling below, Sarah realized she wasn't lost anymore. She wasn't looking for answers from anyone else. She was starting to understand that the path to change, the path to true understanding, was something she would have to walk on her own, one step at a time. And with that, Sarah Rogers was ready to face whatever came next. The following weeks saw Sarah's world shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. With her editorial published and her new perspective making waves across the media landscape, she was thrust into even more intense scrutiny. But this time, the pressure felt different. She no longer felt the weight of defending her old self, the identity that had been so entrenched in activism and system-based solutions. Instead, she was learning to navigate the discomfort of personal growth, of grappling with ideas she had long dismissed. Sarah found herself questioning everything she had once taken for granted. Every new conversation, every debate she was invited to, seemed to open another door in her mind. The balance between systemic change and individual responsibility became her focal point, and she felt both exhilarated and uncertain. What did it really mean to make a difference? Her producer, Lisa, noticed the change in her as well. Sarah wasn't as quick to jump into the same old arguments anymore. She took her time before speaking, carefully considering each response. The sharpness she'd once been known for had softened, replaced with a quiet introspection. "Sarah, you're a different person these days," Lisa said one morning as they were preparing for another show. "I don't know if I should be worried or impressed." Sarah chuckled, brushing her hair back from her face as she scanned her notes. "I think a bit of both is probably fair. I feel like I'm in the middle of something big. I'm not sure where it's going, but I know I can't ignore it." Lisa nodded. "You know, it's not every day you see someone pivot as drastically as you have. A lot of people would just double down on their original stance. But you're making people think, including me." Sarah smiled faintly. She hadn't realized how much of an impact her change had on those around her until Lisa had pointed it out. It wasn't just her career that was evolving. It was her relationships. She felt herself growing in ways that were difficult to put into words. Her family had noticed, too. Over dinner one night, her brother, Matt, had asked her how she was holding up. The conversation had been casual at first, but it soon turned into a discussion about the future. "I think you're right," Matt had said, after hearing her talk about personal responsibility. "The government can't fix everything. People have to take some accountability for their own actions, for their own lives. But you also need a system that's fair." That's where I still think we disagree, though. It's not all about the individual. Sarah had appreciated the way Matt had challenged her without attacking her. It wasn't about winning the argument. It was about understanding each other's viewpoints and finding common ground. The conversations that once felt like battlegrounds were now becoming opportunities to learn. That afternoon, as she sat at her desk preparing for another round of interviews, Sarah was reminded of the promise she had made to herself. She wouldn't stop questioning. She wouldn't let herself fall into the comfort of familiar beliefs, even if they had served her well for so long. She wasn't afraid to admit when she was wrong, and she wasn't afraid to keep evolving. But despite all of this growth, something still lingered in the back of her mind. A question, an uncertainty, gnawed at her. Was this change enough? The political world had already begun to react to her new stance. Some praised her for being open-minded and willing to listen to new ideas. Others, however, saw her willingness to reconsider as a betrayal. To them, it was as if she had abandoned everything they had fought for. A few high-profile allies had distanced themselves from her, while others had publicly criticized her newfound willingness to entertain the idea that the individual had a larger role to play in societal change. At first, this backlash had stung. It was hard to see people she had worked with for years turn their backs on her. But then, after a few days of reflection, Sarah realized that the true measure of change wasn't the approval of others. It was the ability to live authentically, to speak truthfully, and to continue evolving no matter the criticism. "I guess Clint was right," she said aloud to herself one morning as she stared at the mirror, putting on her makeup before a show. It's not always about winning the fight. It's about doing what's right. Sarah had never been the kind of person to run away from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. Despite the growing pressure and the people who doubted her, she was more determined than ever to follow the new path she had started to carve. And then, out of nowhere, an opportunity presented itself. Sarah's team received an invitation to participate in a televised panel discussion, a major national event that would include experts from across the political spectrum. The topic was straightforward: the role of individuals in political change. Sarah's name was already on the guest list, but she had a new decision to make. Would she go in with her old arguments, the ones she had used so many times before? Or would she take this moment to further explore her new understanding and push the conversation in a direction that was truly meaningful to her? Sarah hesitated for a moment, staring at the invitation in front of her. It was tempting to play it safe, to stick with what she knew. But she knew deep down that wasn't the right choice. This was her moment to truly stand by her evolving beliefs, to put her new perspective into practice. With a determined nod to herself, Sarah accepted the invitation. She would no longer be afraid to embrace the discomfort of growth. She was ready to keep learning, to keep challenging herself, and most importantly, to start the conversation in a new way. Later that week, as she stood backstage before the panel, she felt a rush of nervous energy mixed with excitement. There were so many experts, political figures, and pundits on the panel, and Sarah was just one voice among many. But in that moment, as she watched the others preparing, she realized something profound. It wasn't about what she said in that room. It was about what she brought to the table, what ideas she could plant in the minds of those watching. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about contributing to a dialogue that could shape the future. As she walked out onto the stage, Sarah took a deep breath. She wasn't sure where this new road would lead, but she was ready to walk it, step by step, moment by moment. And as she looked at the sea of faces before her, she felt more certain than ever that the road less traveled might just be the one that led to the greatest change of all. And with that thought in mind, she began to speak. As Sarah sat down at the table on the national panel, the room buzzed with the collective energy of people who were ready to assert their viewpoints. The set was sleek and modern, cameras positioned at every angle, capturing every subtle shift in expression. It was a familiar setting, one she had been in countless times before. But today, everything felt different. This was no longer just a debate about policy. It was a debate about personal transformation, about how the individual and the system could intertwine to create lasting change. And Sarah had an entirely new perspective to offer. The panelists ranged from high-profile politicians to seasoned scholars, each one prepared to present their perspective on how individuals could impact political change. Sarah could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to fit into a mold. She had shed the armor of unwavering ideological certainty and instead felt the freedom of exploring new ideas, ideas that might challenge even her own assumptions. The moderator, a calm and composed woman named Jane, opened the discussion by asking the panelists about their views on the relationship between personal responsibility and large-scale political change. "Let's start with you, Sarah," Jane said, turning toward her. "We've seen you evolve in recent months, especially after your conversation with Clint Eastwood. You've said that personal responsibility plays a crucial role in societal change. Could you elaborate on that for our audience?" The spotlight was on her now. Sarah could feel her heart racing, but the nerves were accompanied by a sense of anticipation. She was no longer just repeating talking points she had memorized. She was speaking from a place of true, evolving conviction. This moment, this conversation, was her opportunity to live out the very message she had been grappling with for weeks. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "I used to think that political change started in the halls of Congress or in the chambers of government. I believed that laws, policies, and systemic reforms were the key to solving all of our problems. And don't get me wrong, those things matter. But recently, I've come to realize that change doesn't just begin there. It begins with us, the individuals. The choices we make in our daily lives, the responsibility we take for our actions, and the way we choose to treat others. Those things create ripples. And those ripples can be powerful." The other panelists looked at her, some nodding in agreement, while others raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. The energy in the room shifted slightly. There was something compelling about the honesty in Sarah's voice, something raw about her willingness to embrace this new way of thinking. She continued, her voice steady but impassioned. "I think too often we look for quick fixes, for big policies that will solve all of our problems. But real change is much more gradual. It's about changing the culture, about setting a new example, and about encouraging people to take ownership of their role in shaping society. It's not just about pointing fingers and blaming others. It's about looking in the mirror and asking, what can I do to make things better?" There was a murmur of approval from some of the audience members, but not all of her fellow panelists were convinced. One of the politicians, Senator James Ross, leaned forward and interjected, his tone dismissive. "That sounds nice in theory, Sarah, but the reality is that the systems we live in are rigged against most people. It's all well and good to talk about individual responsibility, but you can't ignore the fact that systemic inequality, economic disparity, and lack of access to opportunity are enormous barriers that people face. Personal responsibility alone won't change that." Sarah met his gaze, undeterred. "I agree with you, Senator. I'm not suggesting that we can ignore systemic issues. They're real, and they need to be addressed. But I'm starting to think that if we want real, lasting change, we have to start by changing the way we think about those issues. We can't wait for the system to fix everything for us. People can't just wait for some politician to save them. They have to be active participants in their own lives. And that means stepping up, making choices that align with the values we want to see in the world, and encouraging others to do the same. There was a moment of silence after Sarah spoke, as the weight of her words hung in the air. It was clear that her approach had struck a chord with some, but others still looked skeptical. The conversation was far from over. Another panelist, a respected economist named Dr. Emily Sanders, chimed in. I think what Sarah is getting at is the idea that systemic change requires a shift in mindset. Yes, we need policies that create more opportunities and address inequality, but we also need people to embrace a sense of personal agency. We can't keep waiting for a top-down solution. It's got to be a collective effort. Sarah nodded, grateful for Dr. Sanders' support. Exactly. Change isn't just about laws or reforms, but about creating a culture of responsibility. If we start with ourselves and inspire others to do the same, that's when the real shift happens. The moderator, Jane, looked between the panelists, sensing the tension but also the potential for a breakthrough. It seems we're seeing a bit of a paradigm shift here. Sarah, you've really challenged us to think differently about how change happens, both on an individual level and at the systemic level. What do you think needs to happen next? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes focused and intent. I think the next step is to have more conversations like this, conversations where we aren't just talking about what's wrong, but about what we can do to make things better. I think we need to stop waiting for some savior, whether it's a politician or a lawmaker. It's up to all of us. If we want a better world, we have to start by creating it ourselves. Every single one of us. As she spoke, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a conversation. This was the beginning of something much bigger. She could feel the weight of the moment, the power of her words, and the impact they were having, not just on the people in the room, but on the viewers watching from their homes. She was no longer just an observer of change. She was part of the change. The panel continued for another hour, with heated debates and differing opinions. But Sarah had said what she needed to say. She had planted the seed of something new. A way of thinking that balanced the need for systemic reform with the power of individual responsibility. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. As the cameras turned off and the panelists gathered their things, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As she walked backstage, Lisa met her with a wide smile. That was incredible, Sarah. You really shook things up in there. Sarah returned the smile, her heart racing with excitement. I think I'm just getting started. She knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges and resistance. But she was ready. She wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. She was ready to lead it. The aftermath of Sarah's appearance on the panel was immediate and overwhelming. As soon as the broadcast ended, the social media firestorm began. Opinions flew in all directions. Some people hailed her as a new voice of reason in the political discourse, while others accused her of betraying everything she had once stood for. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts and notifications pouring in from old friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Some praised her for having the courage to change her mind and challenge the status quo. But there was no shortage of critics either. Sarah, I've watched you for years. This is a complete 180, one message read. You've abandoned everything we fought for. Personal responsibility is just a distraction from the real issues. The backlash was swift and harsh, particularly from her former allies in the progressive movement. The social media attacks came from every direction. Suddenly, Sarah was no longer the star of liberal discourse. She was the traitor. Her critics were quick to point out her shift in ideology, calling it a cynical move to garner attention or an attempt to cozy up to conservative ideals. At first, it stung. The comments were harsh, personal, and even cruel at times. Sarah had always prided herself on being able to weather criticism, but this felt different. These weren't just arguments over policy. They felt like a personal betrayal from people she had trusted and worked with for years. I never thought you'd turn on us like this, one longtime friend, Elena, wrote. I guess all that talk about fighting for the underprivileged was just rhetoric to you, huh? Sarah stared at the message for a long time, her mind racing. Elena wasn't just a colleague. She was a close friend, someone she had shared countless late-night brainstorming sessions with. The idea that Elena now saw her as a sellout was painful, to say the least. It wasn't just her friends who were voicing their disapproval. The media quickly picked up on the controversy, with pundits across the political spectrum weighing in on Sarah's change of heart. Some wondered if it was a calculated move to win over conservative audiences, while others speculated that she was simply confused or lost. One article, titled "The Dangerous Shift of Sarah Haynes," slammed her new perspective as dangerously naive. It argued that Sarah was promoting a false narrative about personal responsibility while ignoring the real structures of power that held people back. The piece ended with a scathing line. Perhaps Sarah is no longer the voice of the people, but of those who don't care about the people at all. The worst part, Sarah thought, was how quickly her words were twisted. A conversation about personal responsibility had been spun into an attack on her commitment to social justice. She knew that she hadn't meant to imply that systemic issues didn't matter, but that wasn't how it was being interpreted. She had expected resistance, but she didn't anticipate the depth of the backlash. At the same time, Sarah realized that this was the moment she had been afraid of for so long. The moment when standing by her beliefs would require her to lose some people she had considered allies. Her world was shifting, and it wasn't comfortable, but she knew, deep down, that this discomfort was the cost of real change. "I can't back down now," she muttered to herself as she scrolled through the comments. "I'm not going to let them intimidate me into silence." The tension in her chest was undeniable, but she forced herself to refocus. This was exactly what Clint had warned her about, the moment when standing up for what you believe in makes you a target. He had faced it for decades, had been called every name in the book, but he had never let it stop him. Sarah turned to Lisa, who had been watching her quietly from across the room. "You okay?" Lisa asked, her voice soft but concerned. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I knew it was coming. I just didn't realize how much it would sting. It's hard to be called a traitor by the people who were supposed to be on your side." Lisa gave her a sympathetic look, but didn't say anything right away. She knew that this wasn't just about politics for Sarah. It was personal. "You can't let them define you, Sarah," Lisa said finally. "You're doing something a lot of people are too scared to do. You're questioning the narrative. That's going to make people uncomfortable, but it's also going to make them think." "I hope you're right," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "I really do." But as the days went on, the backlash continued to grow. The media became even more brutal, and the comments on her social media posts became increasingly vitriolic. They were no longer simply questioning her political stance. They were questioning her integrity, her character, even her motives. Sarah was no stranger to online attacks. She had dealt with criticism before, especially from the right. But this felt different. These were people who once believed in her, people who thought she was one of their own. And now, they saw her as a turncoat. In private moments, Sarah found herself questioning if she had made the right decision. Was her willingness to embrace change worth the cost? Would people ever understand what she was trying to say? Was she even capable of bridging the divide between these two worlds she was now straddling? Then one evening, she received a private message from an unexpected source, Clint Eastwood. "Sarah, keep your head up," the message read. "People are always going to try to tear you down when you push against the current. The fact that they're reacting this strongly means you're doing something right. Stick with it. And if you need anything, I'm here." For a moment, Sarah simply stared at the message. It was simple, but it meant everything. Clint had been through the fire many times in his life, and he knew exactly what she was going through. His words gave her the strength to stand tall. The backlash wasn't going away anytime soon, but Sarah knew that this was a test of her resilience. If she could survive this, if she could stay true to herself despite the pressure, she would emerge stronger on the other side. It was time to keep pushing forward, no matter how much the critics howled. In that moment, Sarah made a vow to herself. She would not let fear of rejection or backlash silence her. She would keep speaking out, keep questioning, and keep evolving. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was hers to walk. And walk it, she would. Sarah woke up the following morning to an inbox full of messages. The world had not paused in the midst of the backlash. If anything, it had only sped up. There was a part of her that wanted to shut it all out. The onslaught of messages, the news articles, the opinion pieces, every notification was a reminder that she had made a choice that was dividing her world. But she couldn't ignore it. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to retreat now. The message Clint had sent her was still fresh in her mind. "You're doing something right." He was right. The resistance she was facing was a sign that she had touched a nerve, a sign that people were paying attention, whether they agreed with her or not. That morning, as she sifted through the barrage of opinions, Sarah came across one message that caught her attention. It was from someone she hadn't heard from in years, her old friend, Michael. "Hey, Sarah. It's been a long time. I saw your appearance on the panel yesterday. I have to admit, I was shocked at first, but I also felt like I was hearing you speak from a place of truth. I think you're onto something, and I'd love to catch up soon. Maybe we can talk through it all?" Sarah hadn't spoken to Michael since their college days, when they had both been active in student politics. They had lost touch over the years, but she remembered him as someone who had always been intellectually sharp, someone who was unafraid to challenge the status quo. She quickly typed a reply. "Michael, it's been too long. I would love to catch up. I think I've got a lot to process, but it's great to hear from you." She hit send, feeling a sense of relief. It was nice to know that, amidst all the noise, there were still people who were willing to listen. Not everyone was convinced by her change in perspective, but some were at least open to understanding it. As the day wore on, Sarah decided to take a more active approach to the criticism. She needed to be proactive, not just reactive. Ignoring the noise wasn't going to make it go away, and she had a feeling that her message had started a conversation that was worth having. Her social media team had been carefully monitoring the situation. They reported that while the backlash was intense, there were also a surprising number of people who agreed with her. It seemed that the conversation about personal responsibility versus systemic reform was one that resonated with a lot of people from both sides of the political spectrum. She decided it was time to address it head-on, not through a press release or a scripted statement, but by engaging directly with her audience. She went live on social media, something she hadn't done in years, and took a deep breath before speaking. "Hey, everyone," Sarah began, her voice steady but sincere. "I've been reading all your messages, and I want to address what's been happening. I've always believed that dialogue is the only way forward, even when we disagree. And I know that my recent comments have stirred a lot of controversy. I want to be clear. I'm not rejecting the need for systemic reform, not for a second. I've never believed that we can change the world by just ignoring the problems. But I also believe that real change starts within us, with the way we live our lives and take responsibility for our actions. That's the message I've been trying to share." She paused, watching as comments and questions began to flood in. Some were supportive, others were hostile, but Sarah felt a sense of clarity in that moment. She had no intention of backing down. This wasn't about appeasing anyone. It was about staying true to her evolving beliefs, even when they were unpopular. "I know this isn't easy for everyone to hear, especially those of you who feel betrayed. But I'm asking you to think with me. Can we make change happen if we keep waiting for someone else to fix things? Or do we need to take personal responsibility and start making those changes in our own lives, in our own communities? The conversation has to be both personal and political." She continued to address the questions that flooded in, speaking candidly about her struggles, her fears, and her hopes for the future. As she spoke, she realized that this was the most genuine she had ever been in front of an audience. This wasn't about playing a part or fulfilling expectations. This was about honesty, about confronting the tough truths that lay beneath the surface. "I understand why some of you are frustrated. I've been there," Sarah continued. "I know what it's like to feel like the system is stacked against you, and I'm not saying it's easy. But change happens when we look inside ourselves and start holding ourselves accountable. That's where it starts. And yes, I still believe we need big, bold reforms. But I'm telling you, nothing will work unless we change the way we think." The live stream went on for nearly an hour, with Sarah engaging in a frank discussion with her audience. The more she spoke, the more she felt the weight of her words. The road ahead was unclear, and there would be more challenges, but she knew that this was the only way forward, by staying true to herself and her beliefs. Afterward, as she ended the live session and looked at the feedback, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that she hadn't expected. The response was mixed, but that was to be expected. What mattered most was that she had created a space for open dialogue. She had taken control of the conversation, and in doing so, she had started to rebuild the bridges that had been burned in the wake of her initial remarks. The critics were still out there. The media would continue to attack her. But Sarah had come to terms with something crucial. She didn't need everyone to understand. She just needed to keep going. A few days later, she received a message from Michael. They agreed to meet for coffee in a quiet cafe. As she walked into the cafe, Sarah saw Michael sitting at a table by the window. He was just as she remembered. Sharp, thoughtful, and exuding an energy that suggested he was always questioning the world around him. "Hey," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Hey yourself," Michael replied with a warm smile. "It's good to see you." For the next hour, they talked about politics, about life, and about what had brought Sarah to this point. Michael listened, and in his thoughtful silence, he gave her the space to articulate what she had been struggling to put into words. He didn't judge her, didn't lecture her. Instead, he asked questions, probed, and helped Sarah explore the new path she was beginning to walk. By the end of their conversation, Michael had helped her clarify a key point she had been wrestling with. Change wasn't a simple thing. It was messy, difficult, and often required people to step outside their comfort zones. She didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. What mattered was that she was asking the right questions. "I think you're onto something," Michael said as they parted ways. "And I think you've just started a conversation that's long overdue." As Sarah walked out of the cafe, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The backlash had hurt, but it was beginning to make sense. The process of change was never clean, never without resistance. But if she could continue having conversations like the one she just had with Michael, maybe, just maybe, she could help lead others toward a new way of thinking. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hopeful again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? After her conversation with Michael, Sarah felt a new sense of clarity. The storm of criticism had not subsided, but she was beginning to see that it was all part of the process. A voice that dared to challenge the status quo would always face resistance, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth listening to. She knew she had to keep going, keep speaking up, and most importantly, keep listening. As the days passed, Sarah found herself navigating through an increasingly complex landscape. Public opinion was still sharply divided. Her live stream had done its job in giving her a platform to explain her stance, but it had also made her a target. The conservative voices praised her for speaking truth to power, but they wanted her to go even further. Meanwhile, the liberal voices saw her as a sellout, someone who had abandoned the fight for justice in favor of a more convenient narrative. Despite the noise, Sarah made a decision. She would take a break from social media. For the first time in a long while, she felt the need to disconnect, to breathe, and to think without the pressure of constant feedback. The weight of the opinions flooding her inbox had taken its toll, and she knew she had to regain her balance. Clint had been right when he said that the loudest voices were often the ones trying to tear you down. But now, more than ever, Sarah realized that it was the quiet moments, the moments of reflection, that were necessary to move forward. She needed to understand why she had made the decision she had and, perhaps more importantly, why she had been so afraid to make it in the first place. That afternoon, Sarah took a walk through the park near her apartment. The sky was overcast, a soft drizzle misting the air. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel muted, as if the world was holding its breath. The park was quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers out. She walked slowly, letting her mind wander as she watched the leaves move gently in the wind. The silence was comforting. For the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. She was free from the clamor of online voices, free from the pressure to respond immediately. It was just her, the rhythm of her footsteps, and the world around her. Her thoughts turned inward. She had always been passionate about justice, about the idea that everyone deserved a fair shot. But over time, she had seen the political conversation shift. The discussions had become more about division than unity, more about placing blame than offering solutions. It was easy to get swept up in the rhetoric, in the loudest voices. It was harder to step back and ask, what do we really need? The more Sarah thought, the more she understood. She had spoken out because she felt that people needed to take personal responsibility for their actions. But she had also realized that systemic issues still played a major role in shaping people's lives. Both could be true at the same time, personal responsibility and systemic reform. The trick was to find the balance between them. Sarah knew that her platform could help build bridges, but only if she was willing to engage honestly with both sides. She didn't want to become another talking head, parroting talking points. She wanted to be part of a real conversation, one that was messy and imperfect but ultimately aimed at finding solutions. As she walked, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Lisa. I know it's been crazy, but how are you holding up? We should talk soon. Sarah smiled and quickly typed back. I'm doing better. Took a break from everything today. But let's catch up soon. She felt better, more grounded. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least she now knew she wasn't alone. She had allies, people who understood the complexity of the issues and were willing to engage with her, not just attack her. That was something she could work with. As the week progressed, Sarah began to make small, deliberate moves to continue the dialogue. She reached out to her contacts on both sides of the political spectrum, people she trusted, people she had disagreed with in the past, but who were all willing to engage in a real conversation. It wasn't about convincing anyone to change their views. It was about learning from each other, understanding the nuances, and moving the conversation forward in a way that wasn't just about winning, but about finding common ground. Sarah also found herself reconnecting with Clint. After all, he had been through something similar: public scrutiny, constant criticism, and the weight of standing firm in the face of it all. He had a unique perspective, one that Sarah knew could help guide her through the rest of this journey. They had a scheduled phone call one evening. Clint's voice, as always, was gravelly but warm. You're doing the right thing, Sarah, Clint said without preamble. Keep your head on straight. I've been there, and it's not easy. The ones who will praise you today are the ones who'll turn on you tomorrow. But that's the price you pay for speaking up. Sarah chuckled lightly. I figured as much. It's just a lot harder when it's happening in real time. Clint laughed. Yeah, no kidding. But you're tough. You don't get this far without knowing who you are and why you're doing it. Trust that. And trust the people who are still willing to listen. They're the ones who matter. His words comforted her, but they also solidified something she had been thinking for a while. She wasn't just here to win a political argument. She was here to push the conversation forward, to challenge people to think critically and compassionately. This journey would be messy, and it would take time. But it was one worth taking. The next day, Sarah found herself at the studio again, preparing for another appearance. The world was still watching, still divided. But this time, she felt a little less alone. She was beginning to understand that change wasn't something that happened in a vacuum. It was something that required effort, persistence, and patience. And it wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about staying true to herself. As she stepped onto the stage once again, Sarah took a deep breath and smiled. The path ahead was unclear, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. The world was waiting. Sarah stood backstage, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The studio lights were blinding, and she could hear the murmur of voices from the crew just beyond the curtain. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to take deep breaths. It was the same feeling as before every broadcast, except now, it felt different. Now, it was more personal. She wasn't just stepping into the studio to perform anymore. She was there to have a real conversation. Today's topic was the ongoing debate about personal responsibility versus systemic reform. A conversation she had started months ago, but one that was now bigger than she could have ever imagined. It had become a battleground. Liberals who had once supported her now saw her as a traitor. Conservatives praised her as a hero one moment, only to criticize her the next for not being radical enough. It felt like she was caught between two fires. Her mind flashed back to Clint's advice. Trust yourself. You know what's right, and you're not alone. It was true. She had spent so long trying to make everyone happy, trying to fit into one mold or another, but the time had come to stop pretending. Sarah had a voice. She had a platform, and if she wanted to continue, she had to speak with authenticity, even if it meant angering people. 5 minutes until we're live, a voice called from behind her. Sarah nodded, taking one last look at herself in the mirror. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto the stage months ago. She had changed. The events of the past weeks had chipped away at her, but also built something stronger inside. It wasn't about avoiding criticism. It was about embracing it and growing from it. As the countdown began, she was escorted to the stage. The audience clapped as she walked in, but the applause felt like an echo. She had become accustomed to the audience's attention, but tonight, it felt hollow. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about what she had to say. The host, Greg, greeted her with a smile, but Sarah could tell he wasn't quite sure what to expect. He was known for being sharp-tongued, always ready with a pointed question. Today, she wasn't expecting anything less. "Welcome back, Sarah," Greg said, shaking her hand. "I have to admit, you've been a bit of a lightning rod in the media lately. Some people love what you're saying, others, not so much. So let's cut to the chase. Where do you stand on this whole debate about personal responsibility and systemic change?" Sarah settled into her seat, looking out at the camera. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for days, but now that she was here, facing the audience, the weight of it hit her all at once. This wasn't just a debate, it was a turning point. "I stand in the middle," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I believe that both personal responsibility and systemic change are necessary. We can't just blame the system for all of our problems, nor can we pretend that the system doesn't play a role in shaping people's lives. The conversation has to include both sides." Greg raised an eyebrow. "But isn't that a cop-out? It sounds like you're trying to appease both sides." Sarah leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "I'm not trying to appease anyone, Greg. I'm saying that we need to have a real conversation about the complexity of these issues. People on both sides are ignoring the reality that there are no easy answers. If we only focus on one side, whether it's individual responsibility or systemic reform, we're never going to make real progress." Greg smirked. "But isn't that exactly what's been happening? We've had decades of debate about personal responsibility and systemic change, and nothing has really changed. People are tired of hearing that both sides need to come together. They want action." Sarah paused, feeling the tension in the air. This was the moment when she had to make her stance clear, not just for the audience, but for herself. "I get it," she said, her voice softening. "People are tired. They want change, and they want it now. But real change takes time. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it requires all of us to look inward as well as outward. The problem is, we've been so focused on the fight between left and right that we've forgotten about the people who are actually struggling. The real question is, how do we address their pain?" The room fell silent for a moment. Greg stared at her, unsure how to respond, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the pressure to perform or deliver the right answer. She had spoken from the heart. Just as she thought the conversation would continue, a familiar voice interrupted the exchange. "Sarah, if I may," a guest on the panel said, "it seems like you're trying to have it both ways. Either we hold people accountable for their actions, or we address the systemic barriers that have been set in place. We can't do both, not with the kind of urgency this country needs." The guest was a well-known activist, someone who had spent years advocating for social justice reform. Sarah could feel the tension between them, but she wasn't intimidated. She had heard this argument before, and it wasn't one she was ready to back down from. "I'm not saying we can't address both at once," Sarah replied, her eyes locked onto the activist. "I'm saying that the urgency we need to solve these problems is not going to come from dividing ourselves into two camps. It's going to come from looking at the whole picture. Yes, personal responsibility is important, but if we ignore the systems that keep people down, we're never going to get anywhere." The activist scoffed, but Sarah could tell she had struck a nerve. The conversation continued to unfold, but Sarah felt herself growing more and more confident with each passing moment. She wasn't here to win this argument. She was here to shift the conversation, to ask people to think differently. By the end of the show, Sarah was emotionally exhausted, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. The panel had been heated, and the debates had been intense, but in the end, she had stood her ground. She hadn't given anyone easy answers. Instead, she had challenged them to think beyond the binary. As the cameras stopped rolling, Sarah stood up and walked off the stage. She felt the weight of the discussion lingering in the air, but she didn't feel defeated. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was on the right path. When she stepped into the green room, Clint was there, waiting for her. "You did good, kid," Clint said, his voice filled with approval. Sarah smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Clint. I don't know if I've convinced anyone, but at least I said what I believe." "That's all you can do," Clint replied, his eyes twinkling with the wisdom only someone with his experience could offer. "You can't change the world in one conversation, but if you keep having them, maybe you'll start to shift the tide." Sarah nodded, knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, ready to fight, ready to listen, and ready to keep pushing forward. The aftermath of the show hit Sarah like a wave. She had prepared herself for the usual criticism, but nothing had quite prepared her for the flood of responses that followed her appearance. It wasn't just the comments on social media or the harsh articles penned by her critics. It was the sheer intensity of the backlash. The conversation had evolved, yes, but it had also become more polarized, more venomous. The next morning, as Sarah scrolled through her notifications, her phone buzzed relentlessly. People from all over the political spectrum were weighing in, and most of them were not pleased with what she had said. "Sarah, you've lost it. You're contradicting everything you once stood for," one comment read. Another, "Just another sellout pushing the same tired nonsense. You were supposed to be the voice of reason, not a puppet for the system." And then, there were the personal attacks. People who once admired her were now calling her a traitor. They accused her of being too wishy-washy, of trying to have it both ways. The word sellout was used more times than she could count. It felt like a gut punch every time she read one of these. But it wasn't just the online world that was turning against her. Her inbox was flooded with messages from people who had once been allies, colleagues who disagreed with her now, and friends who were visibly uncomfortable with her stance. Even Lisa, who had always been her sounding board, had sent her a text that simply said, "We need to talk. Call me when you can." Sarah stared at the text for a long time. She knew what it meant. It wasn't just a casual check-in. Lisa was upset, and the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. The worst part, however, was the doubt that crept in. The words of her critics echoed in her head, and for a moment, she wondered if they were right. Had she watered down her message too much? Was she really trying to please everyone, even at the cost of her own beliefs? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Clint. "Sarah, you okay?" Clint's voice was low, with a tone that suggested he knew exactly what she was feeling. She sighed, trying to hold back the wave of frustration that threatened to swallow her. "I don't know, Clint. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm being torn apart out here." "You know this is how it goes," Clint said, his voice steady. "People don't like nuance. They want something clear, something easy to understand. When you don't give them that, they get mad. But you're doing exactly what you need to do. You're making them think." "I don't feel like I'm making anyone think," Sarah replied bitterly. "I feel like I'm just getting crucified from all sides." Clint's laugh was a sharp sound, but there was no humor in it. "That's part of the gig, kid. Trust me, I've been where you are. The first time I took a stand, I thought the world was going to end, but it didn't. You just have to keep going. Keep your integrity intact, and you'll come out stronger in the end." Sarah closed her eyes, taking in his words. She knew Clint was right. He had been in this game far longer than she had, and yet he still kept fighting. He had lived through the backlash, the hate, the uncertainty, and he had survived. "I guess I just feel alone in all this," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. "You're not alone," Clint reassured her. "You've got people who are listening, people who are paying attention to what you're saying, not just the noise." "Thanks, Clint. I needed to hear that," Sarah said, her voice softening. "Anytime, kid. But don't forget why you're doing this. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. After the call, Sarah stared out the window, deep in thought. The backlash had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. She had come this far because she refused to follow the crowd, because she had believed in a better way of communicating, one that didn't rely on divisive rhetoric. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe people didn't want a better way. Maybe they just wanted someone to pick a side and stick to it. But Sarah wasn't going to give in to that pressure. Not now. Not ever. With newfound resolve, Sarah picked up her phone again. She opened the message from Lisa and called her. "Hey, I saw your text. What's up?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice even. "Sarah, I don't even know where to start," Lisa said, her tone strained. "I've been reading the stuff people are saying about you. I get it. I really do. But you're walking a fine line here. You're alienating people who used to support you." Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the familiar weight of the conversation. "Lisa, I'm not trying to alienate anyone. I'm just trying to have a real conversation. I don't think it's black and white, and I'm not going to pretend like it is." "I get that, I do," Lisa said, her voice softening. "But it's one thing to say that in private, Sarah. It's another thing entirely to say it in public, where people expect you to have a clear stance. Then maybe they need to get used to not having everything tied up neatly with a bow," Sarah replied, feeling a spark of defiance. "I'm not going to play their game anymore. I'm going to speak my truth, and if people don't like it, that's on them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lisa sighed. "I'm not saying I disagree with you, but I just don't want to see you lose everything over this," Lisa said finally. "I don't want you to become the villain in everyone's story." "I'm not the villain, Lisa," Sarah said firmly. "I'm just the messenger. And sometimes, messengers get shot." Lisa didn't respond right away, but Sarah could hear the concern in her silence. After a long moment, Lisa spoke again. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Sarah. That's all. I know, but I'm doing what I believe in. And right now, that has to be enough," Sarah said, her voice steady. The conversation ended, but the doubt still lingered. Sarah hung up, feeling a bit more alone than before. It was hard to explain to Lisa what she was feeling. After all, she was supposed to be the one who had it all figured out. But lately, that feeling was slipping away. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Michael. "Hey, Sarah. I saw your show yesterday. Thought you handled the pressure pretty well. Just wanted to say that I think you're on the right track. Keep going." Sarah smiled at the message. Michael always knew the right thing to say. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that not everyone was against her. There were people who still believed in her, who understood what she was trying to do. And with that thought, she found the strength to press on. The road ahead was tough, but Sarah knew she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The following week was a whirlwind. The backlash hadn't slowed down. If anything, it had intensified. Sarah felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, watching the world swirl around her. The debates and articles continued, as did the attacks, but now there was something else in the air. A sense of uncertainty. Was she making a difference, or was she just adding fuel to the fire? Every morning, she would wake up to a slew of new emails. Messages from strangers, from former colleagues, from people who felt like they needed to tell her exactly what they thought of her stance. Some of it was angry, others were supportive, and a few were downright vicious. But amidst all the chaos, Sarah noticed something else, something she hadn't expected. There were pockets of support, small but growing, from people who agreed with her message, who saw the merit in her approach. They weren't the ones shouting the loudest, but they were there, quietly rallying around her. Sarah leaned back in her chair, glancing at the stack of papers in front of her. She had spent hours preparing for her next appearance, a live debate that would bring together voices from both sides of the political spectrum. She knew it was going to be tense, but it was also her chance to take back control of the narrative. This was her moment to stand firm, to prove that she wasn't just some talking head bouncing between extremes. She was a thinker, a mediator, and someone who believed that real change required a shift in mindset. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Clint. "I saw the comments. Don't let him get to you. Keep your eyes on the prize. What matters is what you're doing out there, not the noise." Sarah smiled at his words. Clint had a way of cutting through the noise, reminding her of what really mattered. His advice was simple: stay true to yourself and keep pushing forward. Her phone buzzed again, this time from Lisa. "We need to talk. You still up for dinner tonight? I think we need to clear the air." Sarah sighed. She hadn't talked to Lisa in a few days, and there was still a heavy tension hanging between them. Lisa was worried, and though Sarah understood why, she still felt the distance between them widening. She didn't want to disappoint her friend, but she also couldn't back down from what she believed in. Sarah sent a quick reply. "Sure, let's talk." As she prepared for the debate later that evening, Sarah couldn't help but think about the path she was on. The media landscape was changing, and so was she. Her voice was reaching more people than ever before. But with that came the responsibility to handle it all with grace and conviction. She couldn't afford to falter. Not now. The studio where the debate was being held was buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived. A few familiar faces greeted her, fellow panelists, some of whom she had worked with in the past. But as she looked around, she realized that the atmosphere was different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that anything could happen. She was led to her seat at the table, next to Greg, the host from her previous appearance, and a few other well-known figures. There were journalists, activists, and even a political strategist. Everyone seemed to have something to prove. The debate began, and right away, Sarah could feel the weight of the eyes on her. Greg wasted no time in diving into the controversial topics of the day. "Sarah," Greg began, "last time you were here, you took a pretty moderate stance on the whole personal responsibility versus systemic change issue. Do you still stand by that?" Sarah took a deep breath, leaning into the question. "Yes, I do. I think it's a conversation that's too often framed in extremes. We've been sold this narrative that it's one or the other, but the truth is, both are necessary. We need personal accountability, but we also need to address the systemic issues that affect people's lives." A few heads nodded, but Sarah could already see some of the other panelists growing uncomfortable. One of the activists, a fiery woman with a strong presence, leaned forward. "Sarah, with all due respect, you can't sit on the fence forever. There are people out there who are suffering because the system is rigged against them. If you're not calling for radical change, then what are you really doing?" she asked, her tone sharp. The words stung, but Sarah wasn't going to back down. She could feel Clint's advice echoing in her head. "Keep your integrity intact." "I'm not sitting on the fence," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "I'm advocating for real solutions. Radical change can't come at the expense of the people who are working hard every day. We need policies that empower people, not just tear down systems without offering a path forward." The activist scoffed, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had learned to tune out the noise and focus on the substance. The debate continued, with each side becoming more heated as the evening went on. But Sarah remained calm, articulating her points with clarity and conviction. She wasn't here to win the fight. She was here to shift the conversation, to offer something different. By the time the debate wrapped up, Sarah was emotionally exhausted, but there was a sense of quiet satisfaction in her. She had held her ground. She had stayed true to herself. Later that night, she met Lisa at their favorite diner. The familiar clink of silverware and the smell of coffee filled the air. They sat down in a booth, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension from earlier in the week was still palpable. "I've been thinking about what you said," Lisa began, breaking the silence. "And I don't know if I can stand by you on this. It feels like you're trying to appease both sides, and in doing so, you're losing the point." Sarah felt the sting of her friend's words, but she didn't react defensively. "I get it, Lisa. You think I'm being too wishy-washy. But that's not what this is. I'm trying to say that the problem is bigger than any one side. I'm trying to find a way to bring people together, to find common ground. We can't fix anything if we're all just shouting at each other." Lisa looked at her, her expression softening. "I understand where you're coming from. I just don't want you to lose yourself in all of this." "I'm not going to lose myself," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But I can't pretend like everything is black and white. If I do, I'm not doing anyone any favors." There was a long pause. Finally, Lisa nodded. "I just want you to be careful. The world out there is unforgiving." "I know," Sarah replied softly. But I can't be afraid to stand up for what I believe in, even if it's uncomfortable. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, both of them lost in thought. Sarah wasn't sure if she had convinced Lisa, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with her choices. As Sarah walked out of the diner that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to change. The debate, the conversations, and even the backlash were all signs that she was on the right track. There was still a long road ahead, but she was no longer afraid of the challenges. In fact, she was ready for whatever came next. The tide was turning, and this time, Sarah was ready to ride the wave. The days following the debate were filled with a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Sarah felt like she had crossed a line, like she had made a declaration not only about her beliefs, but also about her role in the broader conversation. She wasn't just another pundit trying to stir the pot for attention. She was carving out space for dialogue, uncomfortable, but necessary. The public reaction was still divided. Her supporters were steadfast, rallying behind her message. But her detractors, especially those on the far left who felt betrayed, had only grown more vocal. They called her out for what they perceived as fence-sitting, for her refusal to embrace the more extreme solutions that seemed to be gaining traction. Sarah was used to the criticism by now, but the weight of it still stung. Still, she remained determined to keep pushing forward. Her belief in the need for nuance, for finding common ground in a fractured political climate, only strengthened. She couldn't just give up because it was hard. Not now. Not when people were actually starting to listen. One evening, as Sarah was reviewing notes for an upcoming appearance, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but there was something familiar about the area code. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Is this Sarah Miller?" Came the deep voice on the other end. "Yes, it is." "Who's this?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "This is Jack Henderson. I'm with the New York Times," he replied. "I've been following your recent appearances, and I wanted to reach out to you. Would you be open to having a conversation? I think it's time we get your perspective out there in a bigger way." Jack Henderson. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but Sarah couldn't place it. He was a reporter for one of the most respected newspapers in the country, and getting an interview with him could catapult her message to a whole new level. It wasn't the type of offer she could turn down. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd be happy to talk." They arranged a time to meet the following day. Jack's office was downtown, in a sleek glass building that oozed the kind of sophistication that came with years of experience in the industry. Sarah wasn't intimidated by the setting, but she did feel the weight of the opportunity. This wasn't just an interview. It was a chance to clarify her position, to be more than just the subject of controversy. This was her moment to articulate her ideas in a way that people would listen. When she arrived at the office, she was led into a small conference room where Jack was already waiting. He stood as she entered, offering a firm handshake. "It's good to finally meet you in person," Jack said with a warm smile. "I've been following your work for a while, and I think it's time the world hears your side of the story. You've been on the front lines of some pretty heated debates lately, and I think there's more to your message than what's been covered so far." Sarah took a seat across from him, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was her chance to take control of the narrative. "Thank you for reaching out," she said, settling into the chair. "I'm glad for the opportunity to have a deeper conversation about the things I've been discussing recently." Jack set down his notebook and looked at her with a directness that she immediately respected. "Let's start with the basics. You've been criticized for trying to find middle ground in an environment that's increasingly polarized. Why is it so important for you to take this approach?" Sarah paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because I think the answer isn't in the extremes. The more we push ourselves into our respective corners, the harder it becomes to solve the problems that actually matter. We're stuck in a loop of blame, pointing fingers without addressing the root causes of our issues. I believe we need to start having conversations that don't just repeat the same rhetoric. It's not about being wishy-washy. It's about being realistic." Jack nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes as she spoke. "But do you think the political landscape today even allows for such a conversation? The loudest voices often seem to dominate the conversation, and nuance tends to get lost in the noise." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her passion for the subject evident in her expression. I think that's the problem. We've allowed the loudest voices to dictate the terms of the conversation. And that's why things are so toxic. It's not about silencing those voices. It's about amplifying others. The people who want real change, the ones who are willing to listen, to compromise. They need a platform too. Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. And you think people are ready for that kind of dialogue? It seems like we're more divided than ever. I do, Sarah replied, her voice firm. I don't think the solution is just a matter of convincing people who already agree with you. It's about breaking through the echo chambers, having difficult conversations, and finding common ground. It's about being brave enough to have an honest conversation, even if it's uncomfortable. Jack set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. You're talking about bridging the gap between the right and the left, but that sounds like a huge challenge. How do you propose we get there? Sarah thought about that for a moment. She had been asked similar questions before, but this time it felt different. This wasn't a debate or a confrontation. This was a genuine opportunity to express what she believed. I think it starts with acknowledging that both sides have valid concerns. The right is worried about personal freedom and accountability, while the left is concerned about systemic inequality and social justice. We can't just dismiss each other's concerns. We have to listen, and we have to be willing to compromise. It's about finding the shared humanity in all of this. Once we start doing that, we can build solutions that actually work for everyone. Jack's eyes glinted with interest as he nodded slowly. That's a bold perspective, Sarah, and one that's likely to get you both praise and criticism. How do you handle the backlash, the people who see you as betraying their cause? Sarah let out a small laugh. I won't lie, it's tough. There are days when it feels like I'm being attacked from all sides. But I can't let that stop me. The truth is, if I can get just a few people to think differently, to stop and consider a new perspective, then I'm doing my job. Jack seemed to respect her resolve, nodding thoughtfully. I think your message is resonating, Sarah. It's clear that you're not just throwing out sound bites. You're trying to get people to think. And that's rare in today's media landscape. They continued the conversation for another hour, discussing everything from the future of political discourse to the importance of media integrity. By the time the interview was over, Sarah felt a sense of relief. This was the kind of platform she had been waiting for, one where her message could reach a broader audience, unfiltered. As she left Jack's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others out there who were ready for a new kind of conversation, who saw the need for nuance and understanding. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hopeful about the future. She wasn't just a voice in the wilderness. She was part of something bigger. The tide was turning, and Sarah was ready to ride it all the way. The following days after her interview with Jack felt like a fresh start. The article, which was slated to be published in the New York Times, was already stirring excitement behind the scenes. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from her team, friends, and even some acquaintances in the media world, congratulating her for taking a stand in such a powerful way. She knew the article had the potential to reach thousands, maybe millions of people, and she was ready for it. But with that attention came a familiar anxiety. Every time her phone pinged, there was a part of her that tensed up, wondering if the backlash would hit her once again. The far-right critics were already accusing her of being soft and out of touch, while the far left called her a sellout. Sarah couldn't please everyone, she reminded herself. That had never been the point. Still, the tension was palpable. She checked the article draft one more time before it went live, adjusting a few sentences here and there, ensuring her message was clear. She didn't want anyone to misunderstand her position. It wasn't about finding a middle ground just for the sake of avoiding conflict. It was about finding solutions that were sustainable and rooted in common sense. The day the article was published, Sarah felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. Her inbox flooded with notifications from the press, social media, and email. But there was something different this time. Alongside the familiar critics, there were more voices of support than she had expected. People who admired her for her clarity, for her ability to see beyond the partisan divide and call for real change. But Sarah knew she couldn't get too comfortable. She had seen the way public opinion could shift overnight. One moment, you're hailed as a hero, and the next, you're labeled a traitor. As much as she had to ignore the critics, she also had to prepare herself for the unpredictable nature of the media landscape. Her phone rang again. This time it was Clint. "Hey, Sarah. Saw the article. You nailed it. I'm proud of you." His voice was as steady and reassuring as ever. "Thanks, Clint," she replied with a smile. "It feels like it's going in the right direction, but who knows what's next? I don't think I'll ever get used to this roller coaster ride. Don't worry about the bumps. You've got a good head on your shoulders. Just keep doing what you're doing." Clint's voice was always calm, as if he'd seen it all before. In a way, he probably had. "I'll try. I just hope people are listening. I mean, I'm not doing this to be a politician or something. I just want to spark a real conversation." "You already have," Clint said, his tone firm. "The fact that people are talking about it is a win in itself." His words reassured her, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep responsibility settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just sparking conversations. She was challenging people's worldviews. She was calling out the comfortable narratives, and that wasn't something everyone was going to appreciate. That afternoon, as Sarah sat down for another appearance on a news program, she was reminded of just how much scrutiny she was under. The host, a well-known journalist with a reputation for being tough on his guests, welcomed her with a tight-lipped smile. "Sarah, I have to say, your recent article in the Times has stirred up quite the conversation. But I have to ask, do you really think you're going to change anyone's mind by playing the middle? Is that even realistic in today's political climate?" The host, Brian, asked bluntly. Sarah took a deep breath. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to back down. "I don't believe in playing the middle for the sake of being moderate, Brian," she replied, her voice steady. "What I'm saying is that we need to start addressing problems in a way that takes everyone's concerns into account. The idea that we have to choose between personal responsibility and systemic change is a false dichotomy. We need both, and we need to start acting like it." Brian raised an eyebrow. "But don't you think you're asking for too much? People are tired. They want answers, not more talking." "That's fair," Sarah said, leaning forward. "But I think if we keep offering simple, one-size-fits-all answers, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. Real change requires real solutions, and those can't be rushed." The debate went on for another 30 minutes, but the seeds of Sarah's message had been planted. She could feel it, the shift in the room. People were listening. They weren't necessarily agreeing with her, but they were engaging with her ideas, and that was all she could ask for. As the segment wrapped up, Brian thanked her, though there was no mistaking the lingering skepticism in his voice. He wasn't convinced, but he couldn't dismiss her either. And in the world of media, that was a victory in itself. Later that evening, after the segment aired, Sarah sat in her apartment, reflecting on the day. She could feel the weight of everything. Every word she spoke, every reaction she received, every challenge that lay ahead. This wasn't just about being on TV or writing articles. It was about changing the way people thought, about forcing them to confront their biases, their assumptions. She was ready, but she also knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was about to get a lot harder. The next day, as Sarah prepared for another round of media appearances, she received an unexpected call from Lisa. "I saw your segment last night. You're really doing this, aren't you?" Lisa's voice was tinged with both awe and concern. "I am," Sarah replied, smiling slightly. "It's not easy, but it's the only way forward. I just want you to know that I'm behind you, even if I don't always agree with every decision you make," Lisa said. "I think you're onto something here. It's scary, but I think you're making a difference." Sarah felt a swell of gratitude. Lisa's words, though simple, were a reminder that even in the midst of all the controversy, she wasn't alone. She had people who cared about her, people who believed in the potential for real change. "I appreciate that, Lisa. Honestly, it means a lot." After they said their goodbyes, Sarah sat back in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of calm. She wasn't just navigating the storms of public opinion. She was building something. A movement, a conversation, a shift in the way people viewed the world. She wasn't sure where it would take her, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah was ready to face whatever came next. The real challenge had just begun. The days following Sarah's interview were both exhilarating and exhausting. She had gained traction. both positive and negative, within the media sphere, but the intense scrutiny felt like an ever-present shadow. As her phone buzzed constantly with news stories, emails, and social media notifications, Sarah couldn't help but notice the unsettling undercurrent of tension building up. The constant feedback loop from her critics was relentless. Some dismissed her as a weak centrist, claiming she was too afraid to take a stand. Others accused her of being part of the problem, too disconnected from the struggles of the common person. There was even talk of her being co-opted by the establishment, a term she had heard often during her rise in the media. At the same time, Sarah began to receive messages from a broader audience. Everyday people, some from the right, some from the left, expressed how they appreciated her call for nuance and meaningful dialogue. They told her she was speaking for them, people who didn't fit neatly into the polarizing boxes that the media and politicians wanted to place them in. Her message was resonating, even if it wasn't popular. But Sarah couldn't ignore the weight of the storm that was gathering around her. The pressure was building from both sides. The far-right pundits were branding her as a traitor for failing to wholeheartedly support their causes. And the far left? They saw her as a sellout, someone who had abandoned the fight for justice in favor of appeasing moderates. She had painted herself as someone willing to find the middle ground, but in doing so, she had alienated everyone at the extremes. It was a precarious position to be in, and it made Sarah feel more isolated than ever before. One evening, she found herself pacing around her living room, her thoughts racing. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, trying to balance between appeasing her critics and staying true to what she believed. The conversation she was trying to start, one of empathy, compromise, and dialogue, was increasingly being drowned out by louder, more extreme voices. It felt like the world was addicted to chaos, and they weren't willing to listen to the quiet, yet powerful call for change. Her phone buzzed again. It was Clint. "Hey, Sarah. I know this is a lot to take in right now, but I want to remind you, this is exactly what you signed up for. The hard stuff, the uncomfortable stuff. But that's how change happens. You can't expect to shift the conversation without stirring the pot," Clint said, his voice a comforting anchor. "I know. I feel like I'm losing ground, Clint. It's one thing to challenge the extremes, but I'm starting to wonder if anyone's really listening," Sarah admitted, her frustration bleeding into her words. "You're doing the right thing, and you've already proven that people are listening. You're just not getting the instant gratification you might want. Change doesn't work like that. But don't let the noise drown out the good you're doing," Clint said firmly. "Just keep pushing forward. That's what counts." Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of his words. She knew Clint was right. Change wasn't a quick fix. It was a slow, steady process. But the constant barrage of criticism made it hard to keep that perspective sometimes. It was hard not to feel like she was swimming against a current that was getting stronger by the day. The following week, things took a turn for the worse. Sarah was scheduled for another high-profile TV interview, this time with a prominent liberal talk show host whose audience skewed heavily left. As the show approached, Sarah's team briefed her on the host's tendency to push back hard against anyone who dared to step outside of the left-wing orthodoxy. But she knew this was another opportunity to present her message, to continue making the case for nuance and moderation. When she stepped onto the set, the tension was palpable. The host, Heather Matthews, gave her a tight smile, though there was something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't ready to embrace Sarah's message. "So, Sarah," Heather began, leaning forward with an intensity that immediately signaled where the conversation was going. "You've been very vocal about wanting to find middle ground between the right and the left. But don't you think that's part of the problem? The right isn't interested in compromise. They want to roll back progress. And we can't afford to coddle them anymore." Sarah took a deep breath, keeping her composure as she had learned to do over the past few weeks. "I'm not advocating for coddling anyone, Heather. What I'm advocating for is real conversations that actually get to the root of our issues. The reality is, when we only engage with people who think like us, we're never going to solve the problems that matter. We need to talk to people across the aisle, and that doesn't mean giving up on our principles. It means finding common ground." Heather's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sizing Sarah up. "But when people across the aisle are actively trying to dismantle our democracy, Isn't compromise just another form of surrender? No, Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. It's about finding solutions, not just winning battles. If we're only focused on defeating the other side, we're missing the bigger picture. It's not about surrender. It's about building something sustainable. You can't just ignore half the country and hope that works in the long run. The conversation grew more heated as Heather pressed, but Sarah stood her ground, offering the same arguments she had shared before. Compromise wasn't weakness, it was strength. It wasn't about abandoning values, but rather about forging solutions that addressed the concerns of all sides. As the interview ended, Sarah knew the media would spin it as a clash of ideologies. They would frame it as a battle between the right way and the wrong way, the narrative of polarization that was so easy to sell. But for Sarah, it was never about winning the argument. It was about ensuring the conversation didn't stop. That night, as she reflected on the interview, she realized something. Her message wasn't going to resonate with everyone, and that was okay. Not every battle needed to be won on the spot. The fight for a better, more inclusive conversation wasn't a short-term endeavor. It was a long game. Her critics would continue to label her as weak, as a moderate, as someone unwilling to take a stand. But Sarah knew she was doing exactly what needed to be done. She was making space for dialogue where it didn't exist before. She was planting seeds that wouldn't bear fruit immediately, but in time, they would. The storm was still gathering, but she was ready for it. The winds of change were starting to blow, and Sarah was determined to ride them, no matter how rough the journey ahead would be. The following weeks felt like a constant test of Sarah's resolve. As her message continued to ripple across the media, it became clear that the conversation she had sparked was anything but simple. The polarization around her ideas had only intensified. In the weeks after the interview with Heather Matthews, Sarah found herself faced with a continuous flood of media attention, both positive and negative. It was a whirlwind of soundbites and headlines, but beneath all the noise, one thing remained clear. Her presence in the national conversation was no longer a fluke. It was intentional, and people were noticing. But with the growing spotlight came an overwhelming sense of isolation. It was easy to feel disconnected when every conversation around her was one of criticism, support, or simple misunderstanding. No matter how much she tried to hold on to her core values, to stay true to the message of compromise and dialogue, the pressure of public opinion was beginning to take its toll. It wasn't just the constant media scrutiny. The attacks from both sides were starting to feel personal. The far-right commentators criticized her for what they saw as her betrayal of conservative values, while many on the left accused her of being a sellout. It felt as though no one could see the bigger picture she was trying to create, a world where compromise and thoughtful debate were possible. Instead, it seemed as if every word she said was scrutinized for any hint of weakness, any sign of indecisiveness. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her apartment, she found herself staring at the stack of interview requests that had come in over the past few days. More talk shows, more podcasts, more television appearances, more opportunities to get her message out there, but also more chances for her words to be misinterpreted or twisted. The weight of the choices she had to make seemed endless. Should she agree to yet another interview with a hostile host, risking more intense pushback? Or should she pull back and take a break from the media, risking losing the momentum she had fought so hard to build? Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was Clint. "Sarah, I've been watching the coverage," he said, his voice calm as always. "I know it feels like everything is snowballing, but I want to remind you of something important. People are listening. Sure, there's backlash, but you're having an impact. That's the whole point of this. When you speak up like this, you rattle people's cages. It's not supposed to be easy. I get it, Clint, but it's so exhausting," Sarah confessed. "It feels like every time I try to do something that's not extreme, I get attacked from every direction. I can't please everyone, and I don't know if I even want to anymore." Of course you can't please everyone, but you don't need to. You only need to reach the ones who are open to hearing your message. The ones who feel like they're caught between extremes and don't know where to turn. They're out there, Sarah. You've already found them. She nodded, though Clint couldn't see her. His words were exactly what she needed to hear. She had known this from the beginning, but sometimes it was easy to lose sight of the bigger picture in the chaos of it all. Thanks, Clint. I just needed to hear that, she said softly. Anytime. And remember, if it gets too much, just take a step back. You've got this, Clint assured her. The conversation left Sarah with a sense of clarity. She had to keep going. She couldn't let the fear of backlash stop her from doing what she believed was right. The only way to truly make a difference was to stick to her guns, even if that meant stepping into the fire from time to time. She wasn't doing this for fame or approval. She was doing it because she felt, deep down, that it was what the country needed. That evening, as Sarah prepared for her next round of media appearances, she realized that her journey had just begun. The conversation she was starting, one about the necessity of dialogue, compromise, and bridging the divide, wasn't going to be an easy one to sustain, but it was one that was necessary. She had seen it in the messages of support from everyday people, in the conversations she had with her close friends, and in the small victories that often went unnoticed. The next interview would be another challenge, but it would also be another opportunity to keep pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable discourse in this highly polarized world. Sarah wasn't sure where this would all lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than any of the noise around her. Her resolve was firm. She would continue fighting for the message of compromise and understanding, even if it meant enduring the pressure and the attacks. It was time for the country to face the uncomfortable truth. Change couldn't come from just one side. It had to come from all sides. As Sarah stepped into the studio for her next interview, she took a deep breath, her confidence renewed. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The storm would come, but Sarah was ready to weather it. The battle for meaningful change had only just begun. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the escalating tension surrounding Sarah. Every public appearance, every interview, felt like a calculated risk. One misstep and the tide could turn against her completely. Still, there was no turning back now. She had chosen this path, one that asked for boldness in the face of mounting pressure, and she was determined to see it through. The tipping point came unexpectedly during a live segment on one of the largest cable news networks in the country. Sarah had agreed to sit down with a host known for their unapologetic liberal stance. This time, however, the stakes felt higher. Her message of dialogue and moderation had become more polarizing than she anticipated, and this interview would either solidify her place as a thought leader or destroy the fragile narrative she had built. As the show's theme music faded, Sarah's face was lit up by the bright studio lights. She had spent years preparing for this moment, the kind of moment that could either make or break a political career. But now that it was here, she felt a knot in her stomach. Tonight on Real Talk, we welcome Sarah Mitchell, the woman who has been making waves with her call for unity and dialogue in a world of growing division. The host, Claire Rogers, said with a smile, though her tone was anything but friendly. Sarah, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me, Claire, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Claire wasted no time getting to the heart of the issue. Now, Sarah, you've been very vocal about your belief that both the left and the right need to come together for the sake of our country's future. But there's a major problem with that, isn't there? The right has shown time and time again that they aren't interested in compromise. How do you propose finding common ground with people who are actively working against the values you stand for? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the question she had been waiting for, and she knew the response could either make her sound reasonable or naive. Claire, I understand the frustration, Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. But I also believe that if we continue to insist on only engaging with people who agree with us, we'll never move forward. The goal isn't to compromise on our values. It's about building bridges, even when it feels difficult. If we don't at least try to listen to each other, then we're doomed to keep fighting over the same issues without ever finding real solutions. Claire's eyes narrowed. But Sarah, what about the people who are on the other side of this debate and actively trying to dismantle civil rights, women's rights, and environmental protections? How can you sit there and suggest we compromise with them? That's not just naive, it's dangerous. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. It was the same argument she had heard over and over again, and it wasn't just coming from conservatives anymore. People from across the political spectrum were starting to turn on her, dismissing her message of moderation as weak and out of touch with the dire consequences of the moment. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not now. Claire, I'm not suggesting we compromise on the fundamental rights of individuals. That's not what I mean, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. What I'm talking about is finding a way to solve problems that matter, like healthcare, economic inequality, climate change, issues that affect every single person in this country. We cannot keep going around in circles, demonizing each other, and expecting things to magically improve. We need to find common ground where we can work together, even if we disagree on the details. Claire's expression remained skeptical, but the audience was quiet. Sarah could feel the weight of the room, the uncertainty hanging in the air. She was starting to lose some of the edge in the host's voice, but she knew she had to keep going. I'm not saying it will be easy, Sarah continued, her words gaining momentum. I'm saying we have to try. We have to have the courage to step outside of our echo chambers and have honest, difficult conversations. We can't just keep shouting over each other. There was a pause, a brief moment of silence, before Claire leaned forward and spoke again, this time with a more measured tone. I appreciate your idealism, Sarah, but I have to ask, what happens when you keep reaching out to the other side, and they just refuse to meet you halfway? When does it become more than just a fruitless effort? That's a fair question, Sarah replied. But I believe that if we give up on those conversations, then we've already lost. The moment we stop talking to each other is the moment we let division win. We have to keep trying, no matter how many times we fail. Otherwise, what are we fighting for? For a split second, the host seemed to soften. The audience was still quiet, unsure of how to react to Sarah's response. But it wasn't until a commercial break that the full weight of what had just transpired hit Sarah. As she stood up to leave the set, the reality of the situation dawned on her. The tension in the studio had been palpable, and her message had been met with mixed reactions. On one hand, she had stood firm in her belief that dialogue was key. On the other, she knew that there would be backlash, especially from people who believed there was no room for compromise when it came to the fight for justice. But Sarah didn't feel defeated. If anything, she felt more determined than ever. Outside the studio, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Her publicist sent her a quick message. This interview is going to blow up. It's already trending. Hold tight. Sure enough, within hours, the backlash started to pour in. Headlines screamed, "Is Sarah Mitchell out of touch? And why compromise is the last thing we need?" Social media erupted, with some calling her a coward and others praising her courage. The divide that had been forming around her message was now undeniable. But Sarah had no illusions about the nature of her journey. She had expected this. Change wasn't going to come without resistance. She had chosen to take on the mantle of trying to bridge a divide that had been growing for decades. And that, she knew, came with a price. As she sat down in her office later that evening, staring at the news on her laptop, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of clarity. This was the turning point. She had pushed past the point of no return, and there was no going back. The road ahead would be filled with more conflict, more attacks, and more doubts. But in the end, it would be worth it. She was fighting for something greater than herself, and that was all that mattered. Her message was clear. Dialogue, compromise, and empathy were the way forward. It was time to embrace the discomfort. The tipping point had arrived, and Sarah was ready to face it head-on. The following days felt like an endless whirlwind of chaos, each moment more intense than the last. The public outcry following Sarah's interview with Claire Rogers had taken on a life of its own. Headlines, tweets, and op-eds flooded the news cycle, some mocking her, others defending her, but all of them scrutinizing her every word and action. Every time she opened her phone, she was confronted with a new wave of commentary. More arguments, more criticism, more praise. But amidst the storm of conflicting opinions, there was something more profound at play. A shift in the air. A sense that Sarah had sparked something bigger than herself. For the first time, she wasn't just a talking head. She had become a symbol of the struggle for balance in a country that seemed to have lost its sense of moderation. Sarah spent the next few days in seclusion, reflecting on everything that had happened. There were moments when she questioned if she had done the right thing. Was she truly on the right path, or had she just become another talking point in a divisive political landscape? She couldn't ignore the intensity of the backlash. She was being painted as out of touch, naive, even dangerous to the very causes she cared about. And yet, there were also signs of something unexpected. A new wave of support from people who appreciated her bold stance for compromise, people who felt like they had been silenced by the extremes on both sides. In the midst of this, she received an unexpected message from Clint Eastwood. "Sarah," the text read, "we've all been there. This is what happens when you start shaking things up. You've got people on both sides gunning for you. But the ones that matter, the ones who are ready for change, they're watching. And they'll be with you if you stay true to your vision. It's your time." The message came at just the right moment, providing a level of reassurance Sarah hadn't realized she needed. Clint's words were a reminder that this was all part of the journey. She wasn't going to please everyone, and she couldn't expect to. What mattered was the core message. The idea that compromise wasn't weakness, that dialogue wasn't surrender. She had come too far to back down now. Over the next week, Sarah decided to embrace the storm, to step back into the public eye with renewed conviction. Her publicist had been scrambling to manage her schedule, fielding requests from media outlets eager to get her perspective. But this time, Sarah wasn't going to shy away from the tough questions. She was going to confront them head-on. The tipping point had brought her into the eye of the storm, and now she would use it to her advantage. The first opportunity came when Sarah was invited to appear on a popular political podcast that catered to a younger audience. The host, Malik, was known for his no-holds-barred approach to interviewing his guests, but his audience was also known for being passionate, thoughtful, and ready to hear different perspectives. This was a crucial moment, a chance to bridge the gap between her detractors and her supporters, to prove that she wasn't just an anomaly in the political conversation, but someone who could lead the way forward. The day of the interview, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a while. She wasn't nervous, exactly. She had been on plenty of media circuits before, but there was a quiet resolve within her. She had something important to say, and now she was ready to say it. Malik's voice boomed through the headphones as he welcomed her onto the show. "Sarah, thank you for being here. I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of people think you're crazy for pushing the idea that we should compromise with the other side. After your interview with Claire Rogers, you've been called everything from a sellout to a hero. What do you say to that?" Sarah chuckled softly, but there was no humor in her eyes. "I think people have been conditioned to believe that compromise equals weakness, Malik, but I don't see it that way. What I'm advocating for isn't some pie-in-the-sky dream. It's about practicality. It's about finding solutions to the issues that matter to everyone: healthcare, the environment, education, things that affect real people in their daily lives. But what happens when the other side is unwilling to compromise? What if they're the ones refusing to listen?" Malik pushed, his voice full of challenge. "I get it," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "There are people on the other side who don't want to listen. They're entrenched in their views. But that's exactly why we need to talk to them, why we need to engage, even when it feels like they're not meeting us halfway. If we give up on the conversation, we're handing them the victory. I refuse to do that." Malik sat back for a moment, taking in her words. The silence stretched for a second, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The audience could sense the weight of the discussion. Sarah's message was resonating with them. "You've been taking heat from all sides for this," Malik said, his tone shifting to one of genuine curiosity. "Do you ever think about what happens if you fail? What if this whole idea of compromise and coming together just doesn't work?" Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about his question carefully. "I don't think of it as failure. Because to me, failure is when we stop trying. If we stop having these conversations, if we stop reaching across the aisle, then we've already lost. But as long as I'm in this fight, I'm not going to give up on finding common ground. We can't afford to." The conversation shifted after that. Malik began asking more pointed questions about the future of political discourse in America, about how Sarah saw the role of younger generations in shaping the nation's direction. Sarah answered with the same steady conviction, discussing her belief in the power of the next generation to lead, to bring new ideas to the table without being shackled by the extremes of their predecessors. By the end of the podcast, there was no denying the impact Sarah's words had on Malik or his audience. The conversation had been tough, but it had also been filled with substance. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like her message had landed, that it had been heard, not just by the media, but by people who truly cared about finding a way forward. When the interview was over, Sarah stepped out of the studio and into the crisp evening air, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The storm was far from over, but she was starting to feel a sense of calm within it. She wasn't going to win everyone over, and she didn't need to. What mattered now was keeping the conversation going, keeping her message alive. She had faced the eye of the storm, and she had come through stronger on the other side. Now, it was time to prepare for whatever came next. It had been weeks since Sarah's dramatic interview with Claire Rogers, and the ripple effects had only grown larger. The media storm had calmed, but the landscape had shifted irreversibly. Sarah had become a central figure in the political discourse, not as a candidate, but as a symbol, a beacon for those who still believed in the power of unity, dialogue, and compromise in a fractured world. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity. This was the moment Sarah had been working towards her entire career. The days following the podcast with Malik were a whirlwind. Her social media was flooded with messages of support and criticism alike, but something had changed in the tone of the conversations. People, both on the left and the right, were starting to ask the right questions. They weren't just debating whether Sarah's stance on compromise was naive. They were wondering if it was the only path forward in a country that seemed more divided with each passing day. But with this newfound attention came the inevitable backlash. She had expected it, of course. The louder her voice grew, the more she became a target for the political establishment and media outlets who believed there was no place for middle ground anymore. The extremists on both sides of the aisle were relentless in their criticism, accusing her of selling out, of abandoning the very causes she had once championed. But Sarah was undeterred. She knew the road ahead would be rocky, and the backlash would only intensify as she became more of a figurehead. But that didn't matter. She had a vision that wasn't about securing power or winning popularity contests. It was about changing the conversation, about reminding people that, in order to solve the deep-rooted problems of the country, there had to be room for compromise, for empathy, and for understanding the humanity of those who didn't share your views. Clint Eastwood's words still echoed in Sarah's mind. The ones that matter, they're watching. And they'll be with you if you stay true to your vision. And stay true she would. She'd already come too far to turn back now. Sarah's next big opportunity came when she was invited to give a keynote address at the National Policy Forum. It was an event that drew the biggest names in politics, both Democrats and Republicans, and those who had managed to secure a spot at the podium were usually those with the loudest voices. The stakes were high, but Sarah had no doubt that this would be her moment to solidify her message once and for all. In the days leading up to her speech, Sarah immersed herself in research. She reviewed her past speeches, listened to hours of interviews, and studied the data that had guided her platform. But more than anything, she focused on the stories. The stories of families caught in the crossfire of political division. The stories of people whose lives were affected by policies that seemed to disregard their humanity in favor of partisan agendas. These were the stories she would share, the ones that would make people see the consequences of the choices they were making. The day of the event arrived, and Sarah walked up to the stage with a calm that belied the intensity of the moment. The lights above her felt like a spotlight on her, and she could feel the weight of the audience's gaze. But she didn't let the pressure overwhelm her. This was her moment to speak not only to those in the room, but to the millions of people watching from home. As she stepped up to the podium, she took a deep breath, gathered her thoughts, and began. "Good evening," she started, her voice firm and steady, yet filled with compassion. "It's an honor to be here today with so many brilliant minds, dedicated to the future of our country. We all know that the political divide in this nation is deep, perhaps deeper than it's ever been. We argue, we point fingers, and we blame one another for the problems that seem insurmountable. But I'm here today to tell you that there is another way, a better way." The audience grew still, and Sarah could feel the collective breath of the room being held. "We can't keep ignoring the fact that we are all in this together," she continued. "No matter where we come from or what we believe, the challenges we face, whether it's healthcare, climate change, or economic disparity, affect us all. And if we don't start working together to find real solutions, then we're destined to keep spinning our wheels, getting nowhere." She paused, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the eyes of both Republicans and Democrats in the crowd. The silence was deafening. We can't afford to be enemies anymore. We have to be partners in this fight. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm not saying it will happen overnight. But I believe that if we start seeing each other as people first, not as red states or blue states, not as liberals or conservatives, but as Americans who care about the future of our children, the future of our planet, then we can find a way forward. Sarah could feel the weight of her words settle over the room. There was no applause, no loud cheer, just an almost tangible sense of contemplation. But she wasn't finished yet. The path to progress isn't paved with anger and division. It's paved with respect, with dialogue, and with the courage to make tough choices, even when it means stepping out of our comfort zones. We have to be willing to listen to each other, to understand each other's fears, hopes, and dreams. Because, in the end, that's what this is about, humanity. And if we can't find it in ourselves to see that in each other, then we've already lost. As Sarah finished her speech, there was a long moment of silence before the applause began. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it was sincere. Sarah knew that her words had hit a chord. Not everyone in the room agreed with her, and not everyone would. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she had made them think. And thinking, truly thinking, was the first step toward change. That night, as Sarah sat in her hotel room, reflecting on the day, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The road ahead was still uncertain. The backlash would continue, the criticisms would grow sharper, and the battles would be harder. But Sarah was no longer fighting for popularity or recognition. She was fighting for something bigger. A country that remembered the power of unity and the importance of seeing the common humanity in each other. As she stared out at the city skyline, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had weathered the storm, and now she could see the horizon, where the possibility of change was beginning to shine through. It was a new dawn, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to lead the charge. The journey was far from over. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. The fight for a better future had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?